This morning, President Trump says the U.S. obliterated military facilities on Iran's main hub for oil exports, what it means for oil prices, and the future of the fight.
When are you going to know when it's over?
When I feel it.
Okay.
I feel it in my bones.
And thousands of American Marines are heading to the Middle East, along with a warship.
The United States is decimating the radical Iranian regime's military in a way the world has never seen before.
As we learn, 6 more U.S. troops were killed when their refueling plane went down this week.
And the White House orders a coastal American pipeline to restart for the first time in a decade.
That could substantially increase the amount of oil being produced in California. So there's a lot. Every stone is being overturned.
Hear how California's governor is responding. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. It is Saturday, March 14th. We're here with Lisa Mateo. We want to welcome our listeners and viewers across all of our Bloomberg platforms, on radio, on TV, on streaming, on Bloomberg.com, and of course, the Bloomberg Business app.
A busy morning with a lot of news out of the Middle East once again, and we're seeing here signs that missiles have struck the U.S. Embassy in Iraq and getting some extraordinary video, which you can see if you're watching us on Bloomberg Television or streaming this on the app, smoke rising from that embassy compound. And Christina, this is kind of emblematic of what we've seen over these last 3 weeks, the way that this conflict has widened. And also, as you know from talking to your sources, this has become kind of a daily occurrence for many folks in these embassies around the Middle East. Right.
This is an embassy that frequently comes under fire when things flare up in the Middle East because of those proxy fighters in and around Baghdad. This is one of the largest diplomatic facilities in the world for the U.S. This morning also, I was seeing some alerts that Oman has reissued its level 4 travel advisory. That's a do not travel. It's the highest list. And they are also issuing an order departure that is a non-emergency evacuation for American government employees and their families.
Tracking all of this, Lisa Mateo is as well. She has the latest. Lisa, turn it to you.
Yeah, we take you from Baghdad to Kharg Island. Well, President Trump says that the U.S. has bombed military targets where Iran exports most of its oil. Now, it wasn't a social media post. The president called it, quote, one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East, and threatened additional strikes targeting oil infrastructure if Tehran continued to block energy flows. The post came after Trump told reporters the U.S. would continue its campaign as long as necessary. Well, now Iran reiterating its warning that it will target American-linked oil and energy facilities in the Middle East if its own infrastructure is attacked. Now, that's according to the semi-official Fars news agency. It's also reporting that more than 15 explosions shook Kharg Island. At a Pentagon briefing yesterday, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the U.S. and Israel have hit around 15,000 targets since the war began.
That the United States is decimating the radical Iranian regime's military in a way the world has never seen before. Never before has a modern, capable military, which Iran used to have, been so quickly destroyed and made combat ineffective, devastated.
Meanwhile, oil continued its rise with traffic through the Strait of Hormuz effectively at a standstill. Brent crude settled above $100 a barrel for the second straight session, ending the day at the highest level in more than 3 years, while U.S. crude futures, well, they settled near the highest since July 2022. U.S. gas prices already at the highest levels in about 2 years. And in a move to ease fuel pressures, the Trump administration, well, they took action to clear the way for oil production off the California coast. Houston-based Sable Offshore, it's going to begin restoring operations for the Santa Ynez unit, also the Santa Ynez pipeline system in California. And finally, in other news, South Korea's military says North Korea has fired more than 10 ballistic missiles toward the EC. The launch coincides with the annual U.S.-Korea military drills and comes days after Pyongyang tested cruise missiles from a new warship. David and Christina, South Korean officials, U.S. authorities, they are conducting an analysis of those missile specifications.
I think I speak for all of us when I say not now.
Not now. There's too much happening.
Not the time.
Yes.
Speaking of everything that's happening, the U.S. is entering the third week of its war with Iran. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth slammed Iranian leadership and questioned if the new Ayatollah is up for leading the country.
Iran's leadership is in no better shape. Desperate and hiding, they've gone underground, cowering. That's what rats do. We know the new so-called not-so-supreme leader is wounded and likely disfigured. He put out a statement yesterday, a weak one, actually, but there was no voice and there was no video. It was a written statement. He called for unity. Apparently killing tens of thousands of protesters is his kind of unity. Iran has plenty of cameras and plenty of voice recorders. Why a written statement?
Joining us this morning, Bloomberg Jerusalem reporter Dan Williams. We've got Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Jeff Mason, who is traveling with President Trump this weekend. He's in West Palm Beach, Florida. And Philip Crowther is with us as well. He's an international correspondent for the Associated Press and joins us stateside. He is reporting from the Strait of Hormuz this morning. Phil, let me start with you, if I could. And with that attack on Kharg Island, I'm going to read a bit from the Truth Social post the president posted last night about that attack. He said, "At my direction, the U.S. Central Command executed one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East," the president's words, "and totally obliterated every military target in Iran's crown jewel, Kharg Island. Our weapons," he writes, "are the most powerful and sophisticated that the world has ever known, but for reasons of decency, I have chosen not to wipe out the oil infrastructure on the island." Would love to get your perspective from your vantage of the significance of that. We know that 90% of the oil that Iran produces goes through this hub off the coast of Iran. How big a deal is this? And what does it signal to you that it wasn't a kind of full attack on the oil infrastructure on that island, Philip?
Well, first of all, it's certainly considered an escalation by Iran, because shortly thereafter comes the statement from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, says that because those attacks were staged here in the United Arab Emirates, by the way, without proof from Iran that was actually the case, but because of what they think were attacks that came from here, that cities and ports in the UAE are now not safe anymore and are legitimate targets. Iran also says that people here should now leave those places because attacks might be coming. Now, it's worth saying that that has already happened. Remember that the likes of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the biggest cities in the United Arab Emirates, have already seen drone attacks since the start of the US-Israeli war on Iran. But we have, though, as part of that Iranian escalation, at least in theory, we do have seen something concrete on the ground not too far from here. Just south from here in Fujairah is a very large oil facility that was struck earlier this morning by what presumably were Iranian drones. We do not have confirmation thereof, but there were two large columns of smoke billowing from that oil facility just a short while ago. Now, that is particularly important right now, because with the Strait of Hormuz, and you can see the entrance of it right behind me, with it essentially being closed, well, there are some ways of bypassing it to a lesser degree. There are pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that can bring oil away from the Persian Gulf and to other ports where oil can be picked up and where the Strait of Hormuz does not need to be used, and Fujairah, just down the road from here, is one of those. Now, a little note on the Strait of Hormuz. I just mentioned there is very little movement, and we have been watching it from our vantage point here. Almost no movement whatsoever. We can see dozens of ships here. Now, these are tankers that carry oil, but also natural gas. They are waiting to enter the Strait of Hormuz. And then there are hundreds in the Persian Gulf who are waiting to get out. So far, we've seen very little movement. We do know that some China-linked ships have made their way in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, and Iranian ships as well. A tiny, tiny exception they are. Essentially, what we're looking at here is pretty much a full-on blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
All right, I want to pivot to a different peninsula, and that's Jeff Mason, who is with the president in Florida. Jeff, in your latest piece, you've got a good breakdown of what the war is costing so far. U.S. officials told lawmakers the first 6 days of the war with Iran cost more than $11.3 billion, says a person familiar with the matter. How do you think that cost is going to go down with both members of Congress and the American public as this war, as the president has said, could go long, may not go long? We're going to have to wait till he feels it.
Yeah, I asked him that last night on the
I heard you. I thought that was your voice when I was listening to that this morning, Jeff Mason.
Yes, you were spot on there, Christina. And he said it would last as long as necessary. And I think it's worth taking a pause to talk about that for a second, given that just a little over a week ago, I believe, when he was starting to feel politically sensitive to the price of oil and gasoline, he suggested that the war was going to end quickly. He didn't give a timeline then. He hasn't given a timeline now, but he has walked away from that language, and that action right there, verbal decision anyway, is something that I think markets are going to be sensitive to going forward. To your question about Congress, look, the president already has a sales pitch to make to Congress, certainly to Democrats, which I think he's probably much less concerned about. But more generally, there's already some tension there about the fact that he has launched a war in the Middle East without seeking permission from Congress. the Congress, as you well know, also controls the purse strings, and that amount of money is no doubt something that's going to get scrutinized. And as I like to mention, because politics is my wheelhouse, this is an election year, and this is also a president who campaigned on and in fact started his first year talking about government waste and about cutting down on government spending. Obviously, a war costs money. A war does not achieve those particular goals.
Dan Williams, let me turn to you. I want to ask about Israel's incursion into Lebanon, which has really escalated here, and I'm very curious about the end goals for Israel. I know that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was on the ground in Beirut in recent days. Let me play a bit of tape of what he said to both of those feuding parties, Lebanon and Israel.
My strong appeal to both parties, to Hezbollah and to Israel, is for a ceasefire to stop the war and pave the way to find a solution that would allow Lebanon to become a country independent, with sovereignty and territorial integrity respected.
The UN Secretary General saying he made that trip in solidarity, his word, with the Lebanese people. We see reporting from Axios this morning that Israel is planning to significantly expand its ground operation in Lebanon with the aim of dismantling Hezbollah's military infrastructure. That's according to Israeli and U.S. officials. Axios cites, quote, this could be the largest Israeli ground invasion of its northern neighbor since 2006, dragging Lebanon to the epicenter of the escalating war with Iran. Dan, I'm very curious what you're hearing from Israeli officials about the objectives of this military campaign, this effort here to encroach on, perhaps seize more territory in Lebanon.
Oh, that's certainly the mood music. In fact, it was stated explicitly by the Israeli defense minister that, as he put it, the Lebanese state had failed to impose its authority over the entirety of Lebanon, meaning reining in that subnational group Hezbollah, a group that's clearly a cat's paw for Iran, a group that reopened the Lebanese front with Israel in solidarity with Iran a couple of days into this Gulf War, this Iran war that we've all been covering and dealing with. So the Israelis haven't said explicitly how deeply they're willing to go into southern Lebanon. They have ordered out civilians. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have now fled accordingly north of the Litani River, which is the natural demarcation of southern Lebanon. It makes up something like 10% of the Lebanese landmass there. If you believe the Axios report, Israel is willing to go all the way up to the Litani. Again, perhaps there is some saber rattling here, some muscle flexing, given that an invasion on that scale would really require a couple divisions worth of troops. The Israelis may need time to muster that number of men. They have been doing so in recent days. I'm not sure they would want to. I think they would still want to see the Lebanese state intervening, coming in at last moment to really impose its authority on Hezbollah. But given that Hezbollah, especially in recent days, has been escalating rocket attacks into northern Israel, Israel responding in kind, it would appear the escalation vector is very, very clear here.
Philip, I want to ask you, because you're in the area, you were talking about those stranded ships, and later on in the show, we're going to talk to a UN official about what these international agencies are trying to do to help the stranded sailors. About 20,000 stranded merchant marines and sailors on those vessels. 4 have already been killed, 7 injured, and at least 7 ships have been hit either by flying debris or other explosions in the region. What are the different governments trying to do? Are those vessels just sitting out there? Are these sailors coming into port? Are they getting supplies out there? Can you give us kind of a situation?
No, look, the truth is there is pretty much no movement whatsoever. A colleague of mine, though, today was in touch with one of the sailors on one of those tankers, in fact, waiting to go through the Strait of Hormuz. He actually told him that he felt a little bit like a sitting duck and was a little bit afraid that the oil company, or maybe the transport company, wasn't clear there who he mentioned, was feeling the pressure for financial reasons to actually move through the Strait of Hormuz despite the dangers. So that is the situation these seamen are in, essentially. The pressure to make money and to move through the Strait of Hormuz is huge. It's just right now that because of these recent Iranian attacks, and there have been several of them, as you mentioned, and the threats that more will be forthcoming, that the evaluation right now is simply it is too dangerous to move through the Strait of Hormuz. Insurance companies, as I'm sure you have spoken about over the last 2 weeks. Insurance companies have skyrocketing rates, and they also, of course, deem it very, very dangerous indeed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So there is no movement here, not in and out of the strait and not towards any ports either. Now, generally, these are ships, and it is a generalization, but still, they tend to have enough provisions on board once they get close to the Strait of Hormuz, because they know, especially during this time, that something bad could happen and then they might get stuck. So in that sense, they should be okay. Now, what are governments doing? Of course, they want to get their citizens out, but there's very little they can do. That brings us on to an entirely different subject, in a sense, is what can foreign governments do to actually get these ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz? Of course, the Trump administration has spoken about the possibility of escorting ships. It's not something that is happening right now, and it's also something that is very hard to put into place. It is logistically very, very hard, and it's also a military option in a sense, because as long as Iran has the power, the firepower to attack ships and to use drones on cities here in the United Arab Emirates, well, then it should also be powerful enough to take on the U.S. Navy if it brings in escort ships. Now, there's another attempt. France is involved in a potential international coalition to escort ships in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. Again, that takes weeks to set up. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
Jeff Mason, very quickly, want to wrap up with you here. We got about a minute left, and we're kind of threading through the conversation. Comments we've gotten from the president to Brian Kilmeade and on President Trump's Truth Social site. He writes, the fake news media hates to report how well the U.S. military has done against Iran, which is totally defeated and wants a deal, but not a deal that I would accept. And we see this news that the U.S. is sending 2,500 additional Marines to the region. Your read on what that portends? It's going to take about a week for them to get there. What does it say about the president's appetite for a deal in the minute we have left?
Well, number one, I would say that the president is telling the truth when he says the war is going to go on as long as necessary. He does not. It doesn't seem to me like he has an end game in mind, and it does seem like he's prepared to increase resources to achieve the goals that he's looking for. I wouldn't take seriously what he or what Secretary Hegseth said yesterday about how the media should be covering the war. It's our job to cover it truthfully and factually and not take tips from the government. But I would say from an analytical perspective, it is not unrealistic to conclude that they're committed for a long term, even if that has a negative impact on the economy and a negative impact on the president's political prospects in November.
Jeff Mason, thank you very much. Jeff Mason, who covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg. Dan Williams, our Jerusalem reporter, with us this morning, and Philip Crowther, who's with the AP on the Strait of Hormuz. Thank you very much for the time.
Thanks, guys. The Trump administration is trying to boost oil production off the West Coast using the Defense Production Act. Will it help drive down oil, or will it be a drop in the bucket? That's straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with the top stories. And President Donald Trump says the war in Iran is going very well, but he didn't offer much else on when it will end.
I can't tell you that. I mean, I have my own idea, but what good is it? It'll be as long as it's necessary. They've been decimated. Their country's in bad shape. The whole thing is collapsing.
The president was speaking to reporters yesterday. Now, the latest tolls from officials and non-government agencies, it shows nearly 2,600 people have died in the war, most of them in Iran. Now, this all comes as the number of American service members killed rises to 13 after a U.S. refueling aircraft crashed in western Iraq on Thursday, killing 6. Now, the Wall Street Journal reporting 5 U.S. Air Force refueling planes were struck and damaged on the ground at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. No one was killed in those strikes. The Pentagon expected to send more ships and Marines to the Middle East. In other news, U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro vowed to continue her investigation of Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell after a judge rejected subpoenas issued to the central bank.
Jerome Powell today is now bathed in immunity, preventing my office from investigating the Federal Reserve. This is wrong, and it is without legal authority.
Now, Pirro was speaking in Washington, D.C. Now, of course, this all comes as the confirmation of Kevin Warsh could be delayed because of this all happening, too, guys. So we'll see what happens.
Yes, throwing a lot of uncertainty into this, and now it seems like Jerome Powell could be the chair for subsequent meetings besides the one that we have coming up this coming week. So.
Right. Pushback from both parties.
Yes, indeed. All right, we're going to have a conversation now about oil and energy and moving it around the world, the challenges thereof in light of this conflict. And I just want to cite a few figures here. Over the course of this war, the price of oil, the global price of oil, has gone up some 40%. It settled at over $100 for the second day in a row on Friday of this week. And Christina, this is as millions of barrels remain kind of trapped in the Persian Gulf, as we heard from Phil Crowther just a moment ago.
Being called the worst supply disruption in the history of the markets. Iran's new supreme leader is also saying Thursday that the Strait of Hormuz will remain effectively closed for as long as it takes. So with us to unpack some of this, we've got Anthony DePaula. He's Bloomberg's Middle East energy correspondent and on set, Lee Glasgow. He's senior logistics analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you both so much for being with us. Anthony, I want to ask you, because you've heard ovations from the U.S. and other oil-producing nations that they're going to try to tap into strategic oil reserves, get that on the market. Is that really going to make a difference when you look at how much is being lost coming out of the Middle East?
Yeah, that's a very big, increase in the oil that's going to be coming to the market from that strategic release. The overall number is 400 million barrels, which, as I said, is a big number. It's meant to give some underpinning and some confidence to the market. But what we really need to look at is the per day flow of how much oil will be coming to the market. These are going to be supplies from various countries, various consumer countries like the United States, European countries, Japan, and it's going to come as a mix of refined products and crude. But what we're hearing from a lot of analysts who are watching this is that the flow rate will only be about 2 million barrels a day, maybe to 4 million barrels a day on the high side, and that's a lot less than what we're losing from the market right now. So the real loss in the market is because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. That's the entry and exit way in and out of the Persian Gulf, where about a fifth of the daily oil demand transits. So with that blocked, we're losing roughly 20 million barrels a day. There are some pipeline workarounds. Saudi Arabia's got a pipeline that runs from the east to the Red Sea coast in the west. And Abu Dhabi has a pipeline that runs to another emirate, Fujairah, in the United Arab Emirates, which gives them access to the sea outside of Fujairah. But that's talking max 5 to 7 million barrels. So we're really looking at a 13 to 15 million barrel a day loss. So that's not going to be replaced by that strategic reserves release. So unfortunately, it's just not enough oil to balance us out completely in the market.
Lee Glasgow, I've spent an inordinate amount of time kind of watching the map function on the Bloomberg terminal, seeing how these ships have been stuck. There hasn't been a whole lot of movement. We saw that confirmed in real life with Phil Crowther, who's standing in the AUA, kind of looking out at the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. A question to you just about what could get that flowing once again, that traffic flowing once again. And we saw reports that India had brokered a deal with Iran to get some liquefied natural gas through the strait. What's it going to take, barring total cessation of these hostilities, to get some of that traffic moving once again?
I mean, assuming there's no mines in the channels, because there's two channels, one going east, one going west. They're about 2 miles wide, so that's why it's a huge choke point and easy targets. But, you know, we saw when the Houthis were attacking ships in the Red Sea, there were still ships going through the Suez Canal, and those ships happened to be Russian, Chinese, all the friends of Iran. So you could see a continuation of that here in the Persian Gulf. It could help, but then you don't know what the U.S. is going to do. Is the U.S. going to say, no, you guys can't do this because, you know, if you're a friend of Iran, you're not a friend of ours. So we don't really know how this is going to play out. You know, Bloomberg Intelligence has done a lot of work on what's going on. Some of our military experts believe that the strait's going to be closed for a month or two, and so that's going to really have.
What would that mean? Like, what would that mean economically to have that strait closed for that long a period of time?
Well, so I cover all modes of transportation. So obviously it's fantastic for freight rates if you're on the water because, you know, it's taking a lot of capacity out of the market. Whether or not you can get cargo, that's something else, but it's going to raise rates significantly. We've seen tanker rates surge pretty significantly over the last couple of weeks. And so, but the ripple effect is really going to be how is it going to impact the economy? And obviously higher fuel costs are inflationary. People are going to be spending less money at stores because they're spending more on gas, and therefore, like the domestic economy is going to take a hit. And so, you know, GDP expectations around 2.5% right now. Obviously, if the longer this goes, the more that gets shaved off. And so that's going to impact, railroads, trucking companies, and some of these modes here at home in the U.S., the trucking industry was really excited about a recovery that was almost about to start to happen. And so this is really pushing out that recovery further. And when I say recovery, I'm talking about rates, because rates have been pretty depressed in the truckload market.
Anthony, we also were talking a lot about Kharg Island this week and how much damage was done. Whether, obviously, the president said they did not take out the oil facilities there, but we have a new tweet that's just hit from U.S. Central Command saying the strike destroyed naval mine storage facilities, missile storage bunkers, and multiple other military sites. U.S. forces successfully struck more than 90 Iranian military targets on Kharg Island while preserving the oil infrastructure. 1.5 million barrels a day coming out of there, 9/10 of Iran's crude coming out of there. What is the status of that facility? Even if it itself has not been struck, do these strikes around the edges and to the island itself make it more difficult to bring that online if and when the politics make that possible?
Yeah, that facility has actually not stopped shipping oil during the conflict. So we have seen a few tankers tying up there and taking on cargoes and exporting them. So as you guys were just saying, Hormuz is effectively shut to most traffic, but some of those friends of Iran are still going through, and some Iranian vessels themselves. So that 1.5 million barrels a day of exports is pretty much what Iran has been able to do recently by using their fleet, using older vessels, turning off transponders, kind of hiding their ships from global scrutiny. But we can still see that flow going mainly into China, going into some storage. Sometimes it pops up as crude oil from different countries. Curiously, there are certain countries that don't really have any crude production, so to speak, but come up with a sizable amount of exports. And that's basically rebranded Iranian barrels. As for Kharg right now, I mean, as you said, that is a key node for Iranian exports. There is an airstrip on that island. There is some naval infrastructure. So that's what the administration is saying has been hit, and they haven't hit the oil facilities. If you look on X, on a lot of the tanker tracking websites, you will see lots of images of Kharg, and you can see where the jetties are and where those tanks are. And we look at those as well, too. They're quite visible. So from what the administration is saying, they've avoided those sites. The Iranians have even said that they've continued to load as well. All this still, of course, needs to be verified. We will be looking at vessel movements, at satellites, just to see what the real impact is there, and also hearing from people in the market about what vessels are moving. As you said, there was apparently those two Indian LPG tankers that did leave because they're really starved for fuel, so they need to get stuff out of there, and we will keep watching that. But of course, Kharg, all remains to be seen what the actual assessment of that damage is, if any, to the oil facilities. But we would expect that some of that Iranian oil will continue to move even during this conflict.
I want to turn to what the White House has proposed to kind of allay a lot of concern about this conflict and to kind of ameliorate the situation. Of course, there was that proposal to offer reinsurance to a lot of these shippers. There was the release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as we've talked about. Then we have the White House reopening drilling off the coast of California, reopening oil drilling using the Defense Production Act. The Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, was asked about that on Balance of Power yesterday. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Certainly when there's a price indication that's happening right now, this is an opportunity. Shale producers have the ability to increase their production. Some of them have, drilled but uncompleted wells. They just have to turn those on. And of course, we're seeing our partners. I just got back from Venezuela last week, where you've got companies like Chevron that are indicating that they can accelerate their development in places like that. And of course, the administration taking steps in places like California, where we've got offshore in California.
So we'll see what a difference that makes. Of course, California gas price is the highest in the country. Lee, another thing that the White House has proposed here is waiving the so-called Jones Act protections. This is something that requires U.S. vessels to move goods from one U.S. port to another. This comes up time and time again when there is a geopolitical crisis.
People have very strong feelings about the Jones Act.
Comes up time and time again. We have to Google it time and time again to understand what the Jones Act in fact is. What kind of difference could this make if that were to be waived by the White House as they proposed?
Well, just to be clear, I'm indifferent on the Jones Act.
Okay, Jones Act neutral. We got you. It's a safe space for you.
So it's interesting. So this goes against some of Trump's policies of, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. because a big part of the Jones Act is the ship has to be made in the United States and manned by U.S. seamen. And so, it is something that is very interesting because it could relieve some supply to get to California, but the impact to the pump is probably de minimis. So we don't see a huge impact of that happening. But the thought of getting rid of the Jones Act comes up a lot. So we're not quite sure, if this is really going to have a positive impact or impact at all for the issues that are facing the U.S. consumer.
Because a lot of these ships were not U.S. flagged vessels anyway, right?
The Jones Act ships are.
Right, but the overall.
Oh yeah, I mean, most ships are not Jones Act. The overwhelming majority, I think, like 99% of them are not.
Can I ask you a quick question just about fertilizer? We hear this coming up now from the agricultural sector. A lot of concern among farmers that here in this beginning of as we approach growing season aren't going to have access to that because this urea and other stuff isn't going to be able to come here. How big a concern is that, and are there other means by which they can get those products?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, the Middle East in general is not a huge dry bulk market. It's about 10% of the market. It's usually smaller things like fertilizer. Yeah. It's not coal and iron ore like the big commodities. So it is going to have an impact because it is going to cut off that supply. And again, this is all becoming inflationary, right? So if potash and sulfur, you can't get it in the Middle East, you're going to have to get it somewhere else, and the capacity is going to be tightened. But Canada is a big producer of potash, so hopefully the farmers can get it from there.
All right, hopefully so. Lee Glasgow, Anthony DePaola, thank you both so much for joining us.
Yes, and coming up here, the U.S. bombing of a strategic island in the Persian Gulf, as we've been discussing, is something we're going to talk about with a former State Department official as we look at the next steps in this war, that bombing of Kharg Island, what it means for this conflict going forward. Conversation about that coming up right here on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of our top headlines. And a major U.S. military strike on Kharg Island, raising fears of further oil supply disruptions. The island processes about 9 out of every 10 barrels of Iran's crude exports. Yesterday, President Trump said the U.S. spared oil infrastructure, but warned that it could change if Iran interfered with ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said in response that any strike on oil and energy infrastructure would lead to attacks on U.S.-linked energy facilities in the region. The International Energy Agency said this week the war had already created the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. In other news, the Wall Street Journal reporting the U.S. is set to receive around $10 billion fee for the TikTok deal. It's coming from U.S. investors that are involved in the recently completed agreement for China's ByteDance to sell the American operations of TikTok. And in sports, Rory McIlroy, well, extended out to make the cut at the Players' Championship. McIlroy recovering from back injury at the top of the leaderboard. Ludwig Oberg and also Alexander Schauffele as well. And Team USA moved forward in the World Baseball Classic after defeating Canada 5-3 last night. The team will face the Dominican Republic in the semifinals tomorrow in the most anticipated game of the tournament. David and Christina, I gotta tune in, but I think it might be a late game.
A little late. I could ask you some follow-ups on that golf stuff if you want.
I think we're good.
Very good. Lisa Mateo, thank you very much.
It's a lack of golf knowledge at the table we discovered this morning, but we're bringing it to you anyway because
we're frank about what we know and don't know. And baseball, we have covered well. The war in Iran continuing to escalate and widen, as we've been discussing so far this morning. President Trump taking to Truth Social late last night, claiming Iran had plans to take over the Middle East, obliterating Israel, but now, quote, just like Iran itself, those plans are now dead.
All right, joining us now is retired Colonel Joel Rayburn. He's a former member of the National Security Council staff during President Trump's first administration. He was also envoy to Syria and a senior fellow at the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson, I almost got through that whole title, at the Hudson Institute. Joel, thank you so much for joining us. given all your experience in the region and at the State Department, I do want to ask you your take on some of these evacuations. We saw it appears at least the embassy compound in Baghdad seems to have taken a strike this morning. There was smoke rising over that horizon. We've also got ordered departures in Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and a regional consulate in Turkey. What does it do for State Department operations when you have so much going on in a region? You need all those people who know those countries, and you also need them out of harm's way.
Well, good to be with you. Yeah, that's a tough situation because the Iranian regime has been targeting those diplomatic facilities because the Iranian regime doesn't really distinguish between military and civilian targets. They will target each indiscriminately as though they're equivalent. They don't respect that division. So our diplomats on the ground do have to be cognizant of that. It's not the first time that we've had to do this kind of ordered departure or authorized departure from some of these stations because it's the Iranians before who have threatened those facilities. So, yeah, it cuts down on our diplomats' ability to do their work and engage with host nations in those places, but they have to be kept safe.
I want to get your read on this story that's developing that the administration is sending 2,500 additional Marines to the region in light of what's been happening over the last couple of weeks, and that will kind of add to the total of 50,000 American troops that are in the region right now. What does that portend to you? How do you read that? And then I'm curious, as we listen to the president, not ruling out the prospect of there being boots on the ground unequivocally, does it concern you? Does it raise an eyebrow that this could be where we're headed if we have that many new troops headed to the region?
Well, no, because in addition to being a State Department, former State Department person, in a former life, for 26 years, I was an Army officer, and I was actually a military planner and analyst at U.S. Central Command, the headquarters that is carrying out this campaign in lead for the United States. And so I was familiar back then in the olden days with an earlier version of this campaign plan. And the idea of having a Marine Expeditionary Unit to do the kind of operations that you would need to protect commercial vessels, commercial shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz, to be able to do operations in the Persian Gulf littoral to protect shipping, to be able to, it would give the president, would give the CENTCOM commander more options. And it actually signals, I think it's a good signal to the Iranian regime leaders in Tehran that the president and Admiral Cooper are keeping that option open. That's precisely the kind of very well-trained Marine force that you would need in order to be able to seize threatening vessels, in order to be able to disrupt mine-laying operations if the Iranian regime were to do that, or if they were want to try to seize some sort of Iranian island, maybe Kharg Island or other facilities like that. It's signaling that the U.S. has that strategic option.
Colonel, since, as you're saying, this plan did exist during the first term, how closely is this administration's action following that plan, and what comes next?
Well, I don't have any inside information on that. Being retired, I'm out of the loop, so I can only.
But you were in the loop the first time around, so far is it playing out according to plan?
Well, it's so much more advanced. I mean, as someone who was formerly familiar with an earlier version of that plan, the military technology advances just in the 15 years or so since I was involved in that sort of thing are just astonishing, and the military imbalance between the U.S. and Israel on one side and the Iranian regime on the other is far wider than CENTCOM would have enjoyed back then under General Abizadeh, General Petraeus, and so on. It's if you had told me in 2009 that 2 weeks into this campaign plan, the Iranian leadership would be decimated, their ballistic missiles would be down by over 90%, their drones down by over 90%, they would have no operable Air Force, Navy, missile defense, and air defense, I'd have told you were smoking something. But it's just astonishing the military progress that's being made on at an operational level.
You talk about the military progress made. The president sat down with Brian Kilmeade on his radio show a little earlier this week and talked about what an endgame might look like. Let's take a listen to what he had to say to Brian Kilmeade.
We had the greatest economy in history. We still do. Oh, this will bounce right back. When it's over, and I don't think it's going to be long, when it's over, this is going to bounce right back so fast.
When are you going to know when it's over?
When I feel it.
Okay.
I feel it in my bones.
Colonel, I want to get your reaction to that last line, when he feels it in his bones. But you very clearly laid out that list of all of the defensive targets that have been hit by the U.S. and taken offline, the Supreme Leader killed, as you mentioned. Your sense from your experience in the first term and from what you've observed here over the last few weeks of what the endgame is likely to be here and what the timeline this administration is working with?
Well, there's a military end game. There's a military end state that's very clear. There's a political end state that's something different. On the military side, the objectives that they laid out, the President, Secretary Rubio, at the beginning of eliminating the nuclear program, ballistic missile and drone program, the ability for the Iranian regime to use terrorist proxies outside their borders. Those are all well on their way to being accomplished. And then the further phase of essentially eliminating the Iranian regime's production capacity to be able to regenerate those kind of things if there is a cessation of hostilities with an Iranian regime still there in place. Now, the political end state is still unclear. And it seems to me, as I was a staffer for President Trump, we all know the president is someone who likes to keep his strategic options open. He enjoys strategic ambiguity because it gives him leverage in negotiating outcomes. And I think he's still doing that here. Whether he's willing to tolerate an end of campaign with a rump Iranian regime still in place, but greatly weakened with it lacking the capacity to go on into the future is something he's keeping. He's keeping that option open. And that creates confusion on the Iranian regime side. I think that actually hinders their ability to respond, which is what you want.
Colonel, quickly before we let you go, the Secretary of Defense admitted in his press conference this week saying that I can't say that we anticipated necessarily that's how Iran would react. He was being asked about Iran striking regional allies, which in his defense, I think did take quite a lot of people, even regional experts, by surprise. Should the U.S. have anticipated that? And how should the U.S. respond to an Iran that is willing to strike friends and neighbors in the region?
Well, I think when you're planning, when you're going through the permutations and possible scenarios, if you're planning out your war gaming, a campaign plan like this, I think absolutely the planners would have had a scenario where they said the Iranian regime just lash out at the region around it. You would consider that a worst case scenario, but you'd also consider it, I think, low probability because it's something that's so counterproductive to Iranian interests. It's harmed them so much. See, the entire rest of the Arab world and Turkey, were drawn into a conflict that they had intended to stay on the sidelines of.
Colonel, thank you very much. Drawing from your expertise, yes, at CENTCOM, as you mentioned, and on the NSC as well. Grateful for your time on this morning. That's Colonel Jill Rayburn joining us here on Bloomberg This Weekend.
All right, coming up, this morning's front pages, and you can explore live streaming news and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more. It's all in one place. Check out Bloomberg.com/videos. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. David Gura with Christina Ruffini. It is time once again for one of my favorite parts of this still nascent show. That is the front pages.
Where Lisa teaches us things that we either didn't get to or would like to know more about from the week.
Lisa Mateo.
All right, this is a different angle on the war of Iran, kind of looking at farmers. So I want to put this out there. This is from the New York Times. The title is War with Iran Puts Further Strain on America's Pessimistic Farmers. So I want to start with a percentage. So nearly 75% of farmers surveyed before the war said that the crop sector was in this recession, right? Their biggest concern, the high cost of essentials needed to plant their crops. Well, now, as you know, the war in Iran adding more pressure, the planting season getting underway, so it's raising their fertilizer costs. The ships that are carrying the materials to make the fertilizer unable to move through the Strait of Hormuz. Then you have raising the diesel costs. Diesels they need for the tractors to plant the crops. They need them for delivering the farm supplies for the trucks. So they're dealing with all these things. I mean, they have farm debt. Bankruptcies are also an issue even before this all happened for the farmers. So it's this really good, in-depth look into all the struggles that they're going through, because we always touch upon different, sectors and how it's affecting, but the farmers really being hit pretty hard.
Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway making a really good point at the top of a recent Odd Lots episode about this, about fertilizer, saying effectively in the past wars weren't started now, because a lot of farmers were also serving in the military fighting these wars, but also because this is growing season, and to raise the price of fertilizer, make farming difficult, a huge hindrance here. I think, too, just about what we were talking about with Lee Krasser just a few moments ago, that this is going to lead to more inflation, and those farmers who might have been waiting to buy equipment, not just the diesel for their tractors, but tractors themselves may hold off on that as those prices get
And it's not just energy.
higher.
I mean, they've got tariff issues. They've got export issues. They've got a market that's being glutted with soybeans, which is a huge production crop in that area. So it's a tough job. It's a really tough job.
And there's number of bills, too, in the process to try and help them, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, I want to switch to this one because, this weekend, the Oscars, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so this one is Oscars focus. It's from the Washington Post. It says, it's already too late for Timothée Chalamet to win an Oscar. Some people call him Shamalama Ding Dong.
Yes, well.
I am those people.
Yes, you are those people.
I can never say his name correctly. All right. Wait, well, why?
So
Why
here's
is
the
it
thing.
too late?
Okay, the why. So on average, male actors win their Oscars when they're older than women actors. Okay, so the youngest male to win an Oscar, Adrian Brody, 29, when he won for The Pianist.
Yes.
On the female side, you had Marlee Matlin, who won an Oscar at 21.
Oh, right.
So Jennifer
Children of a Lesser
Lawrence was
God.
22.
Yeah.
You think about it. Chalamet, he's 30 years old, so he's nominated for
Wiser than his years, though.
Yes, very wise behind his years.
Yes.
So it kind of it's this look into how sometimes voters can pick someone for their best performance, but sometimes they don't, and they kind of do it because it holds off for the guy who's waited the longest. So, for example, like Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yes.
Remember, he was waiting for that Oscar, and then
Ever
he
young
won.
Leonardo DiCaprio.
He won for like The Revenant, and people were like, "Well, that's not his best role." But
Is he up again this year?
He is up. Yes, for one battle after another.
Stayed out here. I know
People
nothing
really like
about any
that
of these
movie.
movies.
No,
Yes,
I've
it was
been
a good
working.
movie.
I've seen almost
Have you
nothing.
seen Marty Supreme?
This is no.
You haven't. Have you?
I haven't seen Marty Supreme. I saw Sinners.
This
I saw
Oscars
One
coverage
Battle
is
for
going to be very good.
It's
well, no,
good.
you're taking care of it.
Tomorrow, you got to
Yes.
tune into our Oscars interview with Lucas Shaw.
Yes.
Be sure to tune in for that. Have you guys ever heard of rage rooms? This is our next story.
No.
A rage
Lisa,
room.
any room that I'm in is a rage room.
Yes, that's true.
This is from Business Insider, okay? So it says how rage room happy hours are becoming all the rage. Okay, so these are, people are drinking less, so they go for the next best thing to relieve stress and having a cocktail. Instead of doing that, they go to these rage rooms. And these are rooms that you rent out. Basically, they give you a sledgehammer and you go to town on whatever's in there and you smash it and you're
just going wild.
You just go buck wild. And it's supposed to make you feel better. There's a place on the Lower East Side. It's called the Ragery.
Okay.
I think we should go.
Yes.
And relieve some stress. But they're saying people love it. Like they go and sometimes they'll put like a picture of an ex-boyfriend or a girlfriend on something and smash it, or maybe
dark.
a boss, or they just put a picture of the economy on it and just break it a couple pieces. Break it. So it's about $78 for 15 minutes. You can go crazy, or if you want the full office feel,
the full rage,
it'll be $522
wow.
for 45
and what do I get for that?
Just to break
something.
Like
entire office field of like computer equipment, desk, and you just go to town.
Listen, an ex-boyfriend bonfire is free. Just do it in a ventilated area, throw it out the backyard. You're going to be fine.
I'm learning a lot about each of you.
Yes, we have a lot of built-up stress.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
all right.
Let's move on.
We'll send you to the rage room.
Let's go to
one more. You got
weekend.
one more.
Yes, the weekend, okay?
Yeah.
Bloomberg The Weekend, it has this great article. It says, move over Tradwives. Now bread makers are making chores pay. So a Tradwife, it's basically short for traditional wife. There we go. The return to the 50s style, the gender roles when the woman was kind of the homemaker with the kids and the husband was a breadwinner. Well, now women are turning their stay-at-home mom duties into big money because they're becoming influencers. So they're both the homemaker and the breadwinner. So they're called bread makers.
Bread makers.
Do you get it?
I
so
get it.
they're cleaning, they're cooking, they're posting about all these things, and they're landing like big brand deals with some big companies like Unilever, and then also the vacuum cleaner maker Shark. They're working with talent agencies. So they're really learning how to work this and make this into a job for them, where they're saying they can just kind of stay home, take care of the family, and do this at the same time.
You getting this in your algorithm? Is this being pumped to you? I'm not, but maybe not the audience for
almost. It. What I am getting is men who argue that, especially after a divorce, that their wife doesn't get half the assets. Their lawyers are now amortizing what you would have to pay a full-time care worker, cleaner, maid, all those things, and coming up with an annual salary to just, and those numbers are huge.
Wow.
So if you have someone at home, man or woman, doing that, they are paying their way by
not
doing all
a
those
trad divorce settlement. We're different
Let
in
me
this
tell
world.
I scrub some toilets and I don't get a penny.
We'll leave it there. Lisa Mateo with the headlines from papers across the world.
Thank you, Lisa.
Value add, strong value add on this Saturday morning. We are coming up on 8 a.m. in New York City. Ahead in our next hour, we're going to speak with the head of the UN's International Maritime Organization as concern grows about the safety of tankers and ships in the Persian Gulf.
That's right. That and so much more. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. here in New York at Bloomberg's World News Headquarters. Global. I can do it.
Christina Ruffini, David Gura, Lisa Mateo here with you, bringing you the latest news and analysis on this Saturday morning, as we do every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Wall Street time. And some more news out of the Middle East this morning as we see strikes on the embassy compound in Baghdad. And Christina, I know this is something you've been following very closely here. We see video of smoke rising above that compound, of course. Those of us who remember the war in Iraq know this is in the green zone, that heavily fortified part of the Iraqi capital, and part of this larger story here as this war really widens from Iran to all corners of the Middle East.
Early reporting is that strike was somewhere on the helipad, which of course would likely be on the outskirts of that compound, but it is one of the largest diplomatic compounds for the U.S. in the world. I've reached out to some regional sources, and one of the things is as you have people hunkered down and evacuating so many facilities, even the chains of communication that usually happen are not happening as quickly as possible. It's something I've noticed when I reached out this morning. Usually I would get information back right away. People are still asking because people are not at their usual desks. They're not on their WhatsApp. Phone signals are up and down. So it is hard. It is hard to keep track of what's going on. It's hard to exert U.S. influence in a place where your diplomats are scrambling for cover.
And I think of the short history of this war preceding those initial strikes by the U.S. and Israel. We had the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, tweeting out a similar directive that there was uncertainty in the region. He was saying that staff there should pursue perhaps leaving the embassy before this war began in earnest. I mean, this has been something these diplomats across the region have been dealing with now for a couple of weeks. Following this, of course, following news out of the Persian Gulf as well, in that Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. attacking Kharg Island. A lot to get to over the course of the next hour. But first, let's get to the headlines with Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
And we'll take you to Kharg Island. Well, President Trump is saying the U.S. has bombed military targets where Iran exports most of its oil. Now, in his social media post, the president called it, quote, one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. He also threatened additional strikes targeting oil infrastructure if Tehran continued to block energy flows. And that is upping the ante in the Middle East war that's raged for more than 2 weeks, showing little signs of easing. Now, Iran reiterating its warning that it will target American-linked oil and energy facilities in the Middle East if its own infrastructure is attacked. Now, that's according to the semi-official Fars news agency, which is also reporting that more than 15 explosions shook Kharg Island. At a Pentagon briefing yesterday, we had Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. He touched upon Iran and also the Strait of Hormuz.
The only thing prohibiting transit in the Straits right now is Iran shooting at shipping. It is open for transit should Iran not do that.
Well, that's it. Oil continued its rise. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz effectively at a standstill. Brent crude settled above $100 a barrel for the second straight session, ending the day at the highest level in more than 3 years. While U.S. crude futures, they settled near the highest since July 2022. U.S. gas prices already at the highest levels in about 2 years. And in a move to ease fuel pressures, the Trump administration took action to clear the way for oil production off the California coast. Houston-based Sable Offshore will begin restoring operations for the Santa Ynez unit and also Santa Ynez pipeline system in California. And in other news, South Korea's military says North Korea fired more than 10 ballistic missiles toward the East Sea. That launch coincides with annual U.S.-South Korea military drills and also comes days after Pyongyang tested cruise missiles from a new warship. David and Christina, we will keep you updated on all of this.
Lisa Mateo setting the table for us very effectively here on this Saturday morning as we turn to Dan Williams, who's a Jerusalem reporter for Bloomberg News, and to Ben Geman, who's an energy reporter for Axios. And Ben, let me start with you as we look at what's happened here on Kharg Island. Of course, this is an island that was developed first by Amoco, the late Amoco, many decades ago.
An American company, pre-revolution.
Yes, and has been so critical to Iran's energy infrastructure for so long. As Christina noted in the last hour, we're hearing from CENTCOM that those strikes did not affect the oil infrastructure on that island, and Iranian news agency saying, in fact, that's the case. They're still able to produce and move oil through that very critical oil hub in the Persian Gulf. Let's just start, if we could, Ben, just with the importance of this island and what it signals to where this war might be headed.
Yes, and good morning, and thank you for having me on. Kharg Island, it's a pretty small piece of land. My understanding is that it's about the third of the size of Manhattan. So this is a very sort of dangerous game, trying to sort of simultaneously affect military and non-oil targets while at the same time issuing this threat, as you were just describing, saying, if Iran does not allow transit through Hormuz for other ships, that the oil export infrastructure would also be hit there. So yes, this is Kharg Island handles approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports. And let's remember that right now, basically, Iranian oil is more or less some of the only oil that's making it through the Strait of Hormuz right now. Although, your outlet had some really interesting reporting overnight about how some liquefied petroleum gas was able to make it through en route to India based on some negotiation between Iran and India. But yes, I think President Trump is sort of doing something or attempting to do something that's a pretty volatile and dangerous game here, which is to sort of get things flowing a little bit, or at least more, through the strait, while at the same time issuing a threat that, if carried out, would in fact restrict the only amounts of oil that are already sort of getting through. So I'm very curious to see what happens when markets open again on Sunday night.
Dan Williams, I want to go to you because I want to ask you about this Netanyahu quote that you have in your most recent article. The Israeli prime minister, who was very in favor of an operation like this and has been for decades and tried to get this to happen during the first Trump administration, said something that I found rather surprising, and I'd like your take on it, about regime change in Iran, saying, "We are creating the optimal conditions for toppling of the regime. But again, I do not deny that I can't tell you with certainty the Iranian people will bring down the regime. A regime is ultimately brought down from within." Is that likely to happen? And if it doesn't, what was the point of this operation?
Well, I think that's not inconsistent given what we heard from the outset, both from the Israeli prime minister and the U.S. president. You'll remember that in the opening statements on February 28th, when this war began, in fact, Trump had the punchiest line. He said, the Iranian people, the Iranian opposition, should shelter indoors while the bombs drop. The implication being the time would come for them to come out and take the reins of power. So basically, the Israeli prime minister in those public remarks was circling back to that original idea, saying that now help that had been promised had now arrived in Iran. He specifically talked about tactical airstrikes being conducted against Besiege and IRGC emplacements in the streets and checkpoints of Tehran. These are all meant, he said, to embolden the opposition to come out. However, he said he can't guarantee it would happen. Obviously, that would be up to the Iranian people, the opposition, who would face enormous risk still in doing so, despite having seen the state's capabilities drastically reduced by this war. I see no inconsistency there. What was new here was the signaling. The prime minister saying effectively, you waited for the moment has now arrived. It would appear the allies are pressing this advantage as they see it to as far as they can in the coming days to wither the strength of that state as much as possible, including by applying pressure on energy in the hope that there will be some kind of action on the ground on organic uprising. One imagines on the clandestine level, there's also work being done behind the scenes to encourage that.
The latest there from the Prime Minister of Israel. We look to what the President of the United States has said in recent days about the goals and efficacy of these attacks so far. He's in Florida this weekend, but he did talk to reporters on the plane ride down there. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Mr. President, when will the Navy start escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz?
That question there from our Jeff Mason, who covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg News. Jeff joins us now. And Jeff, I'm curious what more he offered beyond that about what we've seen is this real stillness in the Persian Gulf, a real reluctance on the part of these tankers to move through the Strait of Hormuz, despite the fact that the administration has floated reinsurance, has raised the specter of there being naval escorts that haven't materialized yet. When is that likely to change in the estimation of the president?
Good question. First of all, for your viewers and people who are watching on TV, I just want to explain why I'm in a van.
With that incredible hat, Jeff, I must add, an incredible
appreciate
chapeau.
That. I left the hat on for Christina.
If you thought I wasn't going to comment on that hat, but we do want your opinion on what the president said, so I will keep my comments to myself. Yes.
Part of the uniform of a White House correspondent. But to your question, David, the president didn't give a whole lot more detail, and one of the questions I asked was when the Navy ships would start escorting tankers through the Straits of Hormuz, and he said soon. I think that's in part because he is sensitive to the fact that the oil markets are going crazy over this war. And the president has sought to send different signals. Yesterday, this defense secretary said in his press conference about the Strait of Hormuz, we've got it taken care of. You don't need to worry about it. Well, that's not how markets feel. But the administration is primarily focused on actually executing the war. But energy markets and how to deal with that strait is certainly at the top of their mind, even if they're not giving more clarity about when those ships are going to start that operation.
It's very sunny in Florida. I just want to point out there's a reason for the hat. It's in West Palm Beach, and it is sunny.
I've had to sit next to other reporters in those pool vans doing live shots. I have never had to execute one myself. So well done, Jeff.
You can borrow the fedora when you do that.
Ben, I do have another energy question for you. We're talking about the strait and how it's blockaded and possible workarounds. And there aren't a ton, but Saudi does have a few pipelines that kind of go across the Red Sea. And right now they are trying to bring a new one online a little bit faster. It's set to start, or the ramp up production fairly soon, 5 million of barrels per day. And there's a flotilla of tankers kind of en route from the Red Sea to Singapore. I'm wondering if that will help ease the pressure on Asia that seems to be feeling the squeeze from this particular shortage very acutely.
I think perhaps a little bit. All of these solutions are, by some measure, Band-Aids, right? I mean, there's no getting around the sort of massive disruption in the Strait. But yes, I think one of the big questions there is, to what extent does this, while sort of resolving perhaps one risk in getting some more oil flowing into that through that east-west pipeline to avoid the Strait of Hormuz, the ships would still go near Yemen, right? And so, to what extent could there perhaps be some of the risks from the Houthi rebels there? I mean, I think getting to something that Jeff was saying a moment ago, I think a little bit of the sort of lack of clarity perhaps around what the U.S. Military goals here, or what the U.S. sort of military resolution of this could ultimately be, is because I don't think anybody really knows at what point the economic impact of this starts to have really tangible effects on the U.S. military posture and military strategy, right? I mean, there's so much in play. We just had some downward revisions to U.S. economic growth in the fourth quarter of 2025. I think that's probably something that the White House is acutely aware of. This morning, we got gasoline prices now averaging approximately $3.68 per gallon and still headed upward. And so, yeah, I mean, I think one reason why oil markets have not only been obviously had huge upward pressure and prices have soared, but there's also just so much astonishing volatility because the sort of, outlook for how this could possibly end remains so uncertain. And yes, to get back to your question, sending some more shipments through that east-west pipeline could perhaps alleviate, by a little bit of time, these big releases planned from strategic reserves by a little bit of time. You've got a few other minor levers that can be pulled. But again, these are all sort of very small scale solutions to what's a large and absolutely unprecedented problem.
Dan Williams, I opened the New York Times this morning, and there's a piece kind of looking at the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship when it comes to armed conflict and the prospect for armed conflict. And Dennis Ross, a longtime envoy from the U.S. to the Middle East, is quoted in that piece, and he talks about the level of coordination between the U.S. and Israel that's taking place here and how anomalous that is, how different that is than what we've seen in the past. And just to quote from Ambassador Ross, he says it's a level of coordination that would have been, quote, unthinkable in the past. We talked about the quotation that you had in your piece from Prime Minister Netanyahu. We talked to Jeff about what the president has said lately. What is your read on that, how this relationship has evolved militarily, and indeed how much daylight, so much as there is any, exists between the prime minister and the president as this war wages into its third week?
I think the relationship is extraordinarily strong. It has been for a while. What makes it unusual this time is it's so public. The fact that they are so public about how close this alliance is. And in fact, the messaging, if anything, has been strongest from Washington, where you have, for example, the Secretary of War speaking of the Israeli Air Force as a peer to the U.S. air assets. So here, the U.S. is the superpower. Israel is a regional power, yet nonetheless being described as a peer by the more powerful ally. That's remarkable in itself. Also remarkable, the pre-positioning of U.S. refueling tankers at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport, of U.S. F-22s at Israel's Uvda Air Base. This was before the war began. We now know those assets were used. I think we're entering a new phase here where the alliance is being gelled very, very strongly. There will be a redefinition of the relationship when it goes down the line as far as Netanyahu is concerned. When it comes to annual U.S. funding for Israel, that has been a matter of some sensitivity, growing sensitivity, including within the conservative Republican camp in the United States. So yes, this is actually a peer relationship a meeting of allies, albeit on different scale, one on the world stage, the other the regional scale. It could even fit in with U.S. plans to scale down eventually in the Middle East and outsource, as it were, its interest to a present anchored ally in the region on whom it can trust in the long run.
Jeff, when it comes to other potential consequences of this conflict, is the White House, have they voiced concern about how this could be a boost for China and Russia, both economically and politically, as the U.S. gets mired down in the Middle East and has less bandwidth for conflicts in Ukraine or possible conflicts in Taiwan?
I think that's a good question, especially going into the president's trip to China, which is just a couple weeks away. That will no doubt at least be one thing that hangs over his visit with President Xi, and what sort of signals President Xi and China writ large take from President Trump's decision to attack Iran, and what kind of conclusions they may or may not make about that with regard to, I meant to say Iran, I hope that's what I said, to attack Iran, and what conclusions China may make with regard to Taiwan as a result of that. In terms of what have they said, they have weighed in a little bit about Russia and not being happy about Russia perhaps benefiting from this war, but largely they say that they see the two things rather as separate. They are continuing negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, even as they stopped negotiations with Iran.
Ben, let me turn to you quickly in the last minute that we have here. We've talked about these solutions the administration's proposed, one of which is waiving the Jones Act, this prohibition on sending goods from one American port to another, not on an American-flagged ship. In the minute we have left, your sense of what kind of difference, notional or not, that would make if that were to happen?
Yes. So from the sources that I was consulting with about this, the effect is not zero, but it is at the margin. You know, I think most people expect that when you can sort of move some product from the Gulf Coast, or if you could more easily move product on ships from the Gulf Coast over to some East Coast regions, this would perhaps change things by maybe a few cents per gallon at the pump, right? But we already have the rise, we already have this major increase in prices. So would it temper the extent of the rise? Is this one of these minor solutions they could put in place to temper the extent of the rise? Perhaps yes, but it is not something that is going to make a massive or game-changing difference.
Ben, thank you very much. Great to have you with us. That's Ben Geman of Axios, covers energy for that outlet. We had Dan Williams with us as well, our Jerusalem reporter, joining us on this Saturday as well. And Jeff Mason in West Palm Beach, in the back of a car. He's on pool duty.
He's on pool duty. Also, a special thank you to Jeff Mason's hat. For our audio-only listeners, it is worth a Google when you have time.
We should note the president in Southern Florida, South Florida, for the course of the weekend. He's got a fundraiser, I think, on the schedule tonight.
Something called a MAGA roundtable. It is closed press, and then the rest of the day so far is executive time.
But I know that Jeff will be keeping us apprised of any developments over the course of the day and into tomorrow's show as well.
Of course. All right. Coming up, we're going to go deeper into the question of what other world powers and America's adversaries could gain from the war in Iran. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
For joining us live on Bloomberg this weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on some of the top stories. And we're now learning that a Greek oil tanker, it was damaged in a projectile or drone attack in the Black Sea as it sailed toward Russia. Now, that's according to Greece's shipping ministry. No oil spill has been detected. The crew of 24, they are safe with no injuries reported. There's also been no claim of responsibility for that attack. We will keep you updated. Meanwhile, the war in the Middle East, well, it's showing no signs of easing. Yes, the latest tolls from officials there, well, non-government agencies, it shows that nearly 2,600 people have died in the war, most of them in Iran. Now, this all comes as the number of American service members killed rises to 13, and that's after a U.S. refueling aircraft, well, it crashed in western Iraq on Thursday. Now, that the Wall Street Journal also reporting that 5 U.S. Air Force refueling planes, they were struck and damaged on the ground at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. No one killed in those strikes. Now, the Pentagon expects to send more ships and Marines to the Middle East region. Now, in other news, U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro, well, she vowed to continue her investigation of Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. That's after a judge rejected subpoenas issued to the central bank. All right, Piero. Well, she was speaking at a press conference in Washington, D.C. She is against it. But David and Christina, the main thing with this is that her decision to appeal, it could delay the confirmation of Kevin Warsh to succeed Jerome Powell. So we'll see what happens with that.
Talked about earlier, Republicans, including Tom Tillis, saying those confirmation hearings will not go through if that investigation continues.
Yeah, Senator Tillis, in light of this, saying nothing has changed about his stance, that he's not going to work to confirm any Fed appointees going forward here. Still furious about the way that all of this has proceeded. This, of course, just days away from the start of a two-day Federal Reserve meeting. Expected to be one of Fed Chair Jerome Powell's last as chairman, but if there isn't a new chair confirmed by the U.S. Senate, he could be chairing that
could backfire for a president who desperately wants new leadership at the Fed.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, the Trump administration is expanding its war on Iran, attacking a strategic island in the Persian Gulf. The president, though, says he's chosen not to wipe out Iran's oil infrastructure, saying that is, quote, for reasons of decency.
This news following a strike on an Iranian girls' school that killed dozens, with an investigation to whether or not the U.S. was responsible for it still ongoing, according to the president and the Department of Defense. Joining us now, Stuart Livingston-Wallace, Bloomberg's head of Middle East and North Africa coverage, and Andreas Kluth, who's a Bloomberg opinion columnist who covers U.S. diplomacy, national security, and geopolitics. And Andreas, let me start with you. You've written about this attack on that girls' school in Iran, and you write about the lessons that we can learn from that attack so far. One is that terrible things do happen during the course of a war. Two is that history judges war crimes, but it's dependent on the motivations for a particular war, why it was fought. And the third is that integrity matters and starts at the top. So we have, from the New York Times' analysis and others, an indication here the U.S. was, in fact, responsible for this attack. Your takeaway is we see the administration still trying to distance itself from a kind of concrete conclusion of what happened here.
Yes. I mean, the initial reaction, or shall we say, Trump reverted to form. You know, he's a reality TV star who thinks he can bend reality to his will. And he learned early on from Rory Cohn that, you know, you never apologize. You always counterattack. It wasn't your fault. It was someone else's. And on Air Force One, with Pete Hegseth standing behind him, he reverted to form, saying, oh, no, it couldn't have been us. It must have been the Iranians. It was one of their Tomahawks. The problem was the Iranians don't have Tomahawks, cruise missiles. And then he falsely claimed he kept digging himself in deeper, that probably they did have. And now we're having an investigation. We'll have a result. And what matters to the world, to posterity, to outside America, inside America, given that the war aims and objectives have been unclear all along, is that he then owns it. And then he says, and we've had examples in recent decades from similar events, that he says, okay, if it was us, it's terrible. We apologize to, you know, the victims.
Stuart, I want to ask you, because obviously what's going on in Iran is such a huge focus, and reasonably so, but Israel has also reopened this front in its battle against Lebanon. The Lebanese health ministry is reporting 850,000 Lebanese individuals displaced. There was also a strike this week on a healthcare center. Overall, Lebanon is saying 773 people, including 100 children, have been killed in the last 10 days. What are Israel's objectives here? How closely are they coordinating with the U.S., and what does it mean for the region?
I mean, in terms of the objectives, largely the same ones that it's had, you know, the last several rounds of fighting, and it's Hezbollah, and it is linked to Iran. So in the sense that Hezbollah is funded and certainly supported by Iran and has been a thorn in Israel's side for a great many years. And you've had this slightly strange situation where you have the Lebanese government that has been trying to disarm Hezbollah because it knows full well that Israel will come after Hezbollah, that it doesn't necessarily have the capability to do that or the strength to do that. And on this particular round of fighting, Hezbollah sent rockets into Israel in support of Iran when the war kicked off, and Israel has responded in force. So what should we expect going forward? I mean, that is very, very hard to predict. You know, I think Israel is very conscious of what happened in Gaza, or coming across the border from Gaza, several years ago. And since then, you know, it has been incredibly wary about allowing hostile forces on its borders. And you've seen that, obviously, with Gaza, but also with Lebanon and to some extent with Syria and beyond. And in terms of the war with Iran, you know, that is really Israel trying to kind of get at the heart of what it sees as the problem in terms of its security.
Emphasizing the gravity of the situation in Lebanon, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made a trip to Beirut and spoke to Hezbollah and to Israel in comments that he made on Friday. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
My strong appeal to both parties, to Hezbollah and to Israel, is for a ceasefire to stop the war and pave the way to find a solution that would allow Lebanon to become a country independent, with sovereignty and territorial integrity respected.
We see news that President Emmanuel Macron of France is he's invited Hezbollah leaders and Israel to come together for talks about a ceasefire. Andreas, let me turn to you and just ask a variation of the question Christina asked Stuart to you, and that is, I wonder how enthusiastic the U.S. is in supporting this incursion into Lebanon. Yes, there was the attack on Iran that clearly the U.S. more than went along with. How enthusiastic do you think Washington is for the prospects of a wider conflict here in Lebanon?
Especially as Axios and others are reporting that they could be planning a massive ground invasion.
Yep. Enthusiastic is your adjective. How enthusiastic? Well, look, I can't tell you that, but another way to answer that is, would Benjamin Netanyahu even care at this point how enthusiastic Donald Trump is? Recall that the way we got into this general war, the American attack on Iraq, a couple of weeks ago, Marco Rubio said something very revealing. He may have committed a gaffe by the definition of accidentally speaking the truth, which said that they attacked when they attacked because they were sure that Israel was going to strike Iran, and then Iran would have to retaliate against American assets. Therefore, the Americans took the lead in attack. That was just a couple of weeks ago. So Donald Trump has not really been in the driver's seat. It's Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. Israel is acting in its own interests, and it wants to, destroy as much of Iran's aggressive capability as possible, and of course take out Hezbollah. So they will do it. Donald Trump now has to worry, as the superpower should be worrying and used to always worry, about the larger picture. Should we be in the Middle East at all? What is this doing for the world economy, for our own economy? Is this distracting us from other conflicts in the world? How do we keep this? How do we restabilize this chaos? So if it were me, I would not be enthusiastic, but I don't think it is up to him to be enthusiastic or not. Israel will do this. Israel will do the other things, and America is now in this war of choice, whether it wants to or not.
Stuart, we asked our last guest this question, but I'm going to ask you as well. Talk to us a little bit about what this does for U.S. influence and U.S., I don't want to say enemies, but, adversaries, especially when you think about Russia and China. One of the really interesting things I thought was the Ukrainian president saying that he had made an arrangement with the Saudis to help them counter some Iranian drones. But what does this do for the conflicts in Ukraine and for China, their aspirations in Taiwan, especially ahead of the president's visit there next week?
So, I guess a couple of things with regard to Russia is that you've seen those sanctions waivers over the last week with regard to Russian oil exports. And obviously that is, somewhat problematic when the strategy to date has been to try and constrict Russian economic inflows in order to try and stabilize oil markets, or at least energy prices globally. You're having to kind of reverse course on that. That at least on paper, should provide more dollars to the Russian government, and that in turn will feed through into the military activity. In terms of Ukraine itself, I'm not sure it's obvious yet, but I guess there would be some questions there about the supply of weaponry, with quite so much being used in the Middle East right now, and there generally being, short supplies, at least on the types of weapons that they're utilizing. That does have to be an open question. With regard to China, that's much more of a mixed picture. Now, China had built up substantial stockpiles of many commodities, and I wouldn't say it's insulated, but it seems to be in a better position than most. But it is a country that is highly dependent on commodity flows. It is highly dependent on global trade in order to fuel its economy. And on both of those counts, we have disruptions, and very serious disruptions that even if the war ends tomorrow, will take a very long time to iron themselves out. So again, no, this is an open question. I can't give you a definitive answer, but it should be worrisome for any large economy in the world, really.
It's interesting.
Andreas, get a word in here. I know I saw you wanted to comment on that as well, but how does this kind of play into the backdrop of those conversations that are going to take place between Presidents Trump and Xi in just a couple weeks?
Look, if we zoom out for a moment, I mean, first of all, Russia is the winner just because oil prices are going up, and that helps Russia fund its war against Ukraine. But it's irony upon irony upon irony. So you have the Ukrainians offering help. Those are the same that's the same Ukrainian president that Trump a year ago lectured in the Oval Office for having no car. It's a little bit ironic. Trump has confused all along who are America's friends and foes, and he's caused a lot of damage worldwide for the long term in that way. Now, a larger way in which both China and Russia win from this, even though Iran was said to be part of their axis with North Korea, that in an immediate term, that is bad for them. One of their partners, Iran, is under pressure and they can't help or they don't want to help. But in the larger sense, Putin wins because America launched a war that violates international law, by the way, it does, and therefore it will not be showing up again with that argument that Putin shouldn't be invading Ukraine or anyone else for that reason. China, with Taiwan, has designs on Taiwan. International law is more questionable, but China is happy because the American superpower, which is set up to win one major and one minor war at the same time, not more, is exhausting itself in the Middle East and is using and bringing the ammo to the Middle East from Asia.
Andreas Kluth, Bloomberg opinion columnist, and Stuart Livingston-Wallace, Bloomberg head of Middle East and Africa coverage. Thank you both so much for joining us.
As we look ahead to that meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi again a little bit later in the month. Coming up, the Trump administration has floated escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz to get oil moving again. We're going to speak with the head of the UN's International Maritime Organization as Bloomberg This Weekend continues on TV, radio, and online.
For joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of the top stories. And a major U.S. attack on military targets in Kharg Island. Well, that is raising some fears of further oil supply disruptions. Now, the island, it processes about 9 out of every 10 barrels of Iran's crude exports. Yesterday, President Trump said the U.S. spared oil infrastructure, but warned that could change if Iran interfered with ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said in response that any strike on oil and energy infrastructure would lead to attacks on U.S.-linked energy facilities in the region. And the International Energy Agency had said this week that the war had already created the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. To other news, the Wall Street Journal reporting the U.S. set to receive an around $10 billion fee for the TikTok deal. It's coming from U.S. investors that are involved in the recently completed agreement for China's ByteDance to sell the American operations of TikTok. And in sports, Rory McIlroy, well, he makes the cut to the Players' Championship. McIlroy is recovering from a back injury. At the top of the leaderboard, we have Ludwig Oberg and Xander Schauffele. Nailed that. Let's get to baseball, please. Team USA moves forward. The World Baseball Classic defeated Canada 5-3 last night. The team will face the Dominican Republic in the semifinals tomorrow in the most anticipated game of the tournament. David and Christina.
Thanks, Lisa. One of the global economy's critical choking points is the Strait of Hormuz, and it has been closed for days, leading to a massive oil price spike in addition to major supply chain disruptions around the world.
The only thing prohibiting transit in the Straits right now is Iran shooting at shipping. It is open for transit should Iran not do that. And as the world is seeing, they are exercising sheer desperation in the Straits of Hormuz. It's something we're dealing with. We have been dealing with it, and don't need to worry about it.
Joining us now is the Secretary General of the United Nations International Maritime Organization, Arsenio Dominguez. Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for being here. Let me start with what we just heard, and that is the Defense Secretary saying that the Strait, as he put it, is open for transit. Do you agree with that?
I mean, if we actually look into international law, the Strait of Hormuz is open. But I continue to reiterate my message that right now it is not safe for shipping and in particular for seafarers to actually go and trade in the region. because it's too volatile. It's a conflict area, and shipping, again, it's been targeted as a collateral damage for geopolitical situations.
There's also a report in CNN and a couple other places that the American administration underestimated Iran's ability or willingness to functionally close this waterway. Do you agree with that? And do you think that should have been more of a consideration before launching this campaign?
Something that is very clear is that the fact that because of this geopolitical situation, shipping is being highly affected, it demonstrates the importance to always maintain the freedom of navigation, to look after the human aspects, the seafarers that are transiting there, and how any of these conflicts have a negative effect in the global economy when shipping is taking part or is affected.
Let's talk a bit about those seafarers, those who are stuck in and around the strait. What are you hearing from them? What are their concerns at this moment?
I mean, we can only imagine the stress, the mental health, and the fatigue that they are going through. These seafarers, they're completely innocent, and they have no part in this conflict. But the reality is that ships cannot be left unattended because they become a hazard for navigation and as well as the environmental impact. And of course, with all the disruptions and the volatility, including the air traffic, seafarers cannot really go to port and be repatriated. And of course, I will not be expecting that all the seafarers will come to the region in order to continue to look after the vessels. So the reality is that they are trapped. The best that we can do is to continue to de-escalate, look for diplomatic solutions, multilateralism, and allow shipping trade to continue, and for these seafarers not to be innocent victims.
Can you talk to us just about their well-being, how they're doing? I mean, I've got some stats here. It's about 20,000 civilians are stranded in the region. At least 7 ships have been damaged by projectiles. Other ships have been hit and have suffered much worse damage. Are you checking in with them? Do they have enough food and water? Are they able to get off those ships? What is the situation?
So the situation is, for us, we have confirmation of 15 ships that have been targeted and at least 7 seafarers who regrettably have actually died in the conflict. And of course, they take no part in it. Right now, we know that ships cannot operate on this end without new supplies. And this goes from water, food, and fuel oils. And this is one of the main concerns that we're having. I'm calling for all the countries in the region to continue to provide supplies and assistance to these ships, particularly those that are more vulnerable right now. And also working with all the companies, the ship owners, the ship operators, to even remotely, now that we have access for communications, to provide that support when it comes to mental health, when it comes to fatigue, and continue to look after the seafarers, even remotely, to let them know that we are actually really concerned and looking at ways to de-escalate this conflict and for the ships to be able to move. And we cannot forget the families of these seafarers in their countries as well.
That is your message to countries, as you say. Is Iran among them? Have you had any dialogue with the Iranian regime about safety in the Strait and the Gulf more broadly?
I do. I speak with all the countries of the organizations. My role is to maintain a constant dialogue and to bring the parties onto the table. And in fact, the member states of the International Maritime Organizations have decided to call for an extraordinary session of the IMO Council next week to discuss the impact that this conflict is having in shipping, and in particularly what else we can do to guarantee the safety and the well-being of seafarers.
The U.S. has raised the prospect of U.S. naval escorts through the Strait. Do you think that's realistic? Do you think it's doable? And is that something you would support?
We have used naval assets in the past, most recently in the Red Sea, when the Houthis were actually targeting innocent ships and innocent seafarers in that region. But the reality is that this is not a long-term solution. And of course, there's other things that we have to look into it. There needs to be a coordination in order for ships to continue to trade safely in a very narrow strait of around 30 kilometers. We also need to make sure that there is a coordinated approach and that ships will be also assisted because they are in more need. But let's face it, the reality is that even with naval assets, there's not 100% guarantee that an innocent seafarers or the merchant ships cannot be targeted.
When you talk to these merchant ship companies, does that mitigate the risk enough for them? Does that sound like something they would even be willing to do with a naval escort?
Because we actually have experience on that, there will be companies that, if we look into the needs for some ships that are very low on supplies, that may need to actually transit out of the region, through the Strait of Hormuz, that's something that could be considered. Now, the reality is that because we have used it in the past and we have introduced some guidance, companies are exercising maximum analysis when it comes to risk assessments and operational assessments. All this will become part of these situations in case countries could come together and start providing naval assistance for ships to actually sail outside of the region.
One last question, if we could pull back some just to talk about the shipping industry. We've seen the White House propose waiving the Jones Act, which is this U.S. law that makes it so that U.S. vessels have to move goods from one U.S. port to another. What kind of difference would that make to shipping globally, and is that something that you would endorse or support?
We actually work on global regulations. Countries may decide, in accordance to the national policies, to actually waive exchange rules. For us, it's the fact that shipping needs to have respected freedom of navigation in order to operate equally for all the countries. We in these organizations would always work with the member states in order to safeguard the implementation of the instruments and allow shipping to trade in all the ports of the world, as well as to provide the essential goods for everybody in the planet.
Secretary General Arsenio Dominguez, thank you so much for joining us from London. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's not just the price of oil. Gasoline prices and jet fuel are spiking as the war continues, which means it's more expensive to drive and fly ahead of that spring break season. That's next on Bloomberg This Weekend.
And you can explore live streaming news and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more, all in one place. You can check out Bloomberg.com/videos, and something I'll commend from that video hub is our colleague Michelle Hussein's recent interview with Vali Nasser, of course, noted expert on Iran. A very insightful conversation about the state of play in the country, state of play with that war. That, of course, on the Michelle Hussein Show. You can find that and so many other videos, again, on that hub at Bloomberg.com/videos. Much more to come here on Bloomberg This Weekend with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo as we approach our third hour here on Saturday, March the 14th.
Markets paralyzed by the war between the U.S. and Iran, jet fuel and gas prices are also on the rise, impacting the cost of airline tickets just as that busy summer holiday season for travel kicks off.
Sure is. With us now, Benedict Campbell, Bloomberg's managing editor for space and aviation, and Patrick De Haan. He is the head of petroleum analysis at GasBuddy. Benny, great to have you with us. Let me start with you and just get a sense of how much the situation in the Middle East has stabilized. The first couple of weeks of this war, there was so much disruption, so much difficulty for folks who are in the region trying to get out. Here as we begin the third week of this conflict, how much is that kind of equilibrated?
So the picture is still pretty fluid at the moment. What we see is the airlines in the region, so the likes of Emirates, the likes of Qatar Airways, the likes of Etihad, still have a very sort of skeletal service at this point, really nowhere near normal commercial operations. They're mainly flying people out. There's a couple of planes coming back in, but those are almost empty in many cases. That's the picture on the ground there. If you look at the region, normally this would be one of the busiest sort of aviation regions in the world. And right now, if you look at a map, if you look at something like Flight Radar or so, it's really sort of a big black hole that we see right now. Very few planes going in and out. And that obviously has a massive effect on global traffic. An airport like Dubai is a massive transfer hub. So a lot of people transferring through Dubai on their way from Europe or the US into Asia. So these people now have to look for alternative routes. That's sort of the picture on the ground. But as you said, for the global industry, one massive knock-on effect are the fuel prices. Kerosene is the single biggest expense for an airline, and we have some airlines that hedge for this, the likes of Ryanair, which is a low-cost carrier in Europe, or Lufthansa, but a lot of airlines do not. In the US, there's really very little or no hedging going on, and in Asia, the same thing. Some airlines have since so-called fuel surcharge fees. So they've increased the fee that they charge passengers, and essentially for the higher costs. And that's really happening around the world. We've heard from Air New Zealand, we've heard from Cathay Pacific, we've heard from airlines in Europe and in the US. So this is sort of how they're reacting short term. Longer term, we may see airlines taking a dimmer view of 2026 and really rethinking what their earnings picture looks like. That could happen probably as soon as next week or, in the not too distant future.
So, Patrick, if you are a person looking to have a vacation this summer, it seems like the options are not great, because if you drive, that's gas. If you fly, that's gas. And we're also now dealing with this still lingering partial shutdown of DHS. And I was looking at lines out of the Austin airport stretched down the length of the airport and onto the street, people waiting to get through TSA as those employees are still not getting paid and starting to call out of work. What are the best options? Is it more expensive to fly or drive? And then what do you see? Do you see this situation at the airports getting better anytime soon?
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, there's a lot more expense whether you're hitting the road or flying in the friendly skies, and gas prices continue to climb across the country. Now, as to which is better, you're going to have to look at the calculations there when it comes to hitting the road. There's a lot of states where prices are still somewhat low, in the low to mid $3 range. And then you have other states like in the West Coast that are much above $4 a gallon. In fact, 12 states, GasBuddy counts now with gasoline prices over $4 a gallon. That could be where the national average is heading to. As consumers are looking at their options, it really just makes a lot of difference on where they're coming from and where they're potentially driving to determine what's the better way to go. Now, anecdotally, I was looking at some airfares that are up 20% already for this summer. So for some consumers, it may be a little too late to jump on that last second airfare, and you may be resigned to hitting the road. In some states, gasoline prices are still relatively low. In fact, for now, the gasoline portion of the barrel of oil is probably the least impacted by what's happened. When you look at nationally, average gas prices up 77 cents. That really pales in comparison to looking at jet fuel increases up almost double that, and diesel prices now, which are well beyond the $5 a gallon mark. So gasoline, at least for now, is the least affected of that. But as we get into spring, we can expect gasoline prices to continue going up because of the seasonality. So consumers that are making that option, depending on what month, gas prices could nationally be 25 to 50 cents higher by the time we get to the start of the summer travel season.
Patrick, on this network, we often talk about the long variable lags in the context of monetary policy, but I'm curious about the length of those lags when it comes to gas prices. So what you were just talking about, I mean, it's been extraordinary to see the spike that we have seen over these last couple of weeks. What is that relationship like between gasoline and oil? And sort of as you look at where this is going directionally, how high do you expect gas prices will climb here if things continue apace?
Well, it's certainly very quick, by the way. Technology over the last several years has really empowered gas stations to be able to adjust their prices very quickly in real time from a centralized location and pass those increases along very quickly. There's very little lag time, maybe just 12 to 24 hours from what stations are paying in terms of the higher costs and passing it along to motorists. Now, as to how long this will last, obviously every day that we keep going and seeing the escalations with the president now putting Kharg Island at risk certainly will likely change the calculus as markets reopen Sunday. So not really any good news here for consumers is that the conditions continue to escalate, and gas prices now at this point could be affected starting into the summer travel season. I think it would take another month or two for prices to kind of level back out, and we still have those seasonal factors that are putting upward pressure on prices, even if there is downward pressure from the situation in the Middle East. So not looking really good, and the national average certainly, as I mentioned, could hit the $4 mark. In some states, it could near $5, and all of it really is tied to the Strait of Hormuz and any escalations that develop. That's going to tell us how long prices remain elevated, and at this point, probably looking at months of elevated prices, not weeks.
Yeah. Patrick De Haan there of GasBuddy, thank you very much for your time. Our thanks to Benedict Campbell, who heads up our global aviation coverage here at Bloomberg News as well. And Christina, a very good question you asked just about the long-standingness of this partial government shutdown. No, the whole government is not shut down, but this is really having an acute effect on a lot of folks here.
Right, and it's not like even if this remedies these oil, these trades are going to take a long time to get back flowing again. All right, we're coming up on 9 a.m. in New York. We're going to head back to MidEast with a report from outside the Strait of Hormuz, plus a conversation with former U.S. Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
This morning, President Trump says the U.S. obliterated military facilities on Iran's main hub for oil exports, what it means for oil prices, and the future of the fight.
When are you going to know when it's over?
When I feel it.
Okay.
I feel it in my bones.
And thousands of American Marines are heading to the Middle East, along with a warship.
The United States is decimating the radical Iranian regime's military in a way the world has never seen before.
As we learn, 6 more U.S. troops were killed when their refueling plane went down this week.
And the White House orders a coastal American pipeline to restart for the first time in a decade.
That could substantially increase the amount of oil being produced in California. So there's a lot. Every stone is being overturned.
Hear how California's governor is responding. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, March 14th, and we have a lot to get to today. So we're going to go straight to Lisa for the latest on the headlines in this hour. Lisa?
Yeah, President Trump upping the ante in the Middle East war that has now raged for more than 2 weeks. Now, he made a post on social media that the U.S. had bombed military targets where Iran exports almost all of its oil, calling it, quote, one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. Trump also threatened additional strikes targeting oil infrastructure if Tehran continued to block energy flows. Now Iran reiterating its warning that it will target American-linked oil and energy facilities in the Middle East if its own infrastructure is attacked. That's according to the semi-official Fars news agency. It's also reporting that more than 15 explosions shook Kharg Island. And at a Pentagon briefing yesterday, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he said the U.S. and Israel have hit around 15,000 targets since the war began.
That the United States is decimating the radical Iranian regime's military in a way the world has never seen before. Never before has a modern, capable military, which Iran used to have, been so quickly destroyed and made combat ineffective, devastated.
Oil continued its rise. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, and effectively at a standstill. Brent crude settled above $100 a barrel for the second straight session, ending the day at the highest level in more than 3 years. U.S. gas prices already at the highest level in about 2 years. And in a move to ease fuel pressures, we have the Trump administration taking action to clear the way for oil production off the California coast. Houston-based Sable Offshore, it begins restoring operations for the Santa Ynez unit, also Santa Ynez pipeline system in California. And drone attacks on Russia, that has sparked a fire at an oil refinery, also caused some damage at a key port in the southern Krasnodar region. Now, this comes as Ukraine also faced one of the largest missile and drone strikes so far this year, with at least 4 people killed. We'll keep you updated on that. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. Lisa Mateo with those headlines.
Thank you, Lisa. We're going to go back now to the region, and we want to turn to AP international correspondent Philip Crowther, who's in the UAE right by the Strait of Hormuz. And Philip, you've sent our control room and our producing team a photo of what you're seeing because the camera, as often happens, is locked down and can't pan. But can you talk to us about what the situation is there in the Strait, especially for those boats and ships, as I just was corrected, it's a ship, not a boat, are stranded with a lot of sailors and seafarers essentially stuck out there until this resolves, or the U.S. decides and these companies agree to military escorts, at least to get them out of harm's way, if not to continue oil flowing through that region?
Yeah, they're at a standstill right now. I think that photo is proof of what we've been doing here over the last few days, is just looking out onto where we are, which is the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz on the Emirati side. We're right next to the Omani border, the Strait of Hormuz shared by Oman and Iran, the other side thereof. And every time a ship, be it a tanker or a different bulk carrier, for example, that appears, we of course try to make out where it's going and what it's doing. The one you can see just behind my shoulder on this side here, that is a container ship that has been here for days. And when we look a little bit further afield, and that is out of shot here, we can see sometimes, especially at nighttime when the lights are on, we can see dozens of ships that are waiting to enter the Strait of Hormuz. So we are seeing here, right on the ground, we are seeing the direct effects of the US-Israeli war in Iran and the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We, of course, look look at the apps like Marine Traffic, some of these ships can be identified, others cannot, but we do see dozens waiting to get in and through the Strait of Hormuz. And in the Persian Gulf, we know that there are hundreds of ships, and these include, of course, oil tankers and those who transport natural gas as well, waiting to get out and bring that oil and natural gas into the international market. There have been very, very few exceptions to this standstill. We know that one or two ships have made their way out through the Strait of Hormuz towards India. We also know that there have been some China-linked ships that have been allowed through, essentially. And when I say they've been allowed through, this is first of all the Iranian government, the Iranian leadership, and the Revolutionary Guards saying, you are not allowed through. But more than anything, the reason why these ships are not moving is because of the threats that they could be attacked if they try to move through the Strait of Hormuz. And that is exactly what has been happening over the last 2 weeks of this war. Some of those ships who've tried to make that passage, they have been attacked. So the risks are simply deemed too high by the oil companies, by the transport companies, also by the insurance companies whose rates have been going up and have skyrocketed. That is why we are seeing this standstill here at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz.
Philip, you're at the mouth of the strait, as you say, but farther north at Kharg Island, we had this bombing campaign by the U.S. overnight, destroying a lot of military infrastructure, but the U.S. adamant in saying that it did not destroy any of the oil infrastructure thereon. Help us understand the importance of that island, some 15 miles offshore from Iran, to the Iranian oil economy, to the global oil economy, and how that complicates this story about the strait even more.
Yeah, I was reading that the output of that island itself exceeds most OPEC producing countries.
Yeah, it is a huge oil processing area on that island, and it had been noted by many analysts that it had not been attacked during these last 2 weeks of U.S.-Israeli war in Iran. That changed overnight. Now, the administration says that it did not hit any oil facilities, and Iran, in fact, today is saying that those oil facilities are indeed still functioning. Now, we'll have to wait and see until there's maybe satellite imagery or any proof on the ground. Very difficult to get that independently, of course, in Iran, to see whether indeed the U.S. was able to differentiate between military targets and oil facilities. Now, an attack on Kharg Island, even if it's just on military targets, is definitely deemed an escalation by Iran. And the Revolutionary Guard of Iran has made that very clear. It has since said that because of that U.S. attack, it is now envisaging further attacks of its own on ports here in the United Arab Emirates, on cities here. But of course that has already happened, because Dubai and Abu Dhabi are of course the biggest cities here in the United Arab Emirates, and they have seen the effects of Iranian retaliatory attacks. So not that much has changed, but the warning is a pretty stark one. It is basically saying that people are supposed to move out of these cities, away from the ports, to be safe. And one example thereof came this morning. The Fujairah oil facility is just south from where I am right now, and it is a crucial one, especially when the Strait of Hormuz is essentially closed. It is a very important oil facility for the United Arab Emirates. It was hit by what is believed to be drone debris earlier this morning, with 2 big plumes of black smoke coming from there. That is significant, that there have been further attacks from Iran. And again, we're saying debris, so this could have been a lot worse. The attacks on oil facilities in Gulf countries continue.
All right, Philip, stand by for us, because we want to go back to Florida now, and our own White House correspondent, Jeff Mason, who looks like he has escaped the pool vans, and I'm assuming you're in a hold room somewhere. Jeff, I want to ask you, as we talk about oil prices, gas prices, ahead of summer travel, what it's doing, impact on folks, we're not hearing that much from the White House about concern. The president has said over and over again he's not worried about it. They'll come back down. But how much patience do you think the president and the White House is expecting to get from the electorate, especially going into those contentious midterms in November?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends, Christina, entirely on how consumers react and on how long this war goes and how much closer we get to those November elections with the impact of the oil prices. The president has said, I think he said again last night, that he thinks that oil prices will really come down sharply once the war is over. But the president has not articulated a timeline for when that's going to be, and he's given mixed signals to the market about what his own plans are with regard to fighting and with regard to the continued operations of the war. So, but to your initial question, it really all comes down to what consumers are willing to tolerate. The administration has used language such as short-term pain for long-term gain. That may work. It may work with President Trump's base, but we do know that voters vote on their pocketbooks, and if it gets to November and gasoline prices are still high, they'll draw a direct line between that and this war.
Jeff, the president must be flummoxed when he looks at all the U.S. has done here in terms of releasing so much oil or beginning to release so much oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and that in coordination with other countries around the world. 400 million barrels, not an insignificant sum of oil that these countries have begun to release. And yet he looks at the price of the oil, settling yesterday, global oil above $100 a barrel for the second day in a row. What is the White House's messaging on that, the degree to which the policies that they are putting in place, trying to put in place, aren't really doing much to bring down oil amidst concern about how long this conflict might last?
It didn't really work, did it, David? And you got to wonder. Yeah, I mean, I think your question is good. It must be frustrating particularly when there's an international response like that, including U.S. release of reserves from the SPR, along with reserves from other allies around the world. I think to your question, the answer is they are saying that they're looking at every option they can to help bring fuel prices down. And no doubt that effort will continue. They've got the energy secretary, they've got others, members of the cabinet and other parts of the administration doing what they can. They've got a toolbox, and they say that they're going to use all the tools in it. But again, just politically, it's tricky. It's tricky. And it is also got to be frustrating when one of those tools, the one that you just mentioned in terms of releases of reserves, doesn't really have a measurable effect on the pricing.
All right, Jeff Mason, Bloomberg White House correspondent, and thank you so much to Philip Crowther, who is at the UAE for the Associated Press. He's their international correspondent.
I want to stick with the thing we were just talking about with Jeff, that is the release of this oil and the negligible effect it's having on the global oil price, and bring in former Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, who joins us now. He's the founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation, the co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for the time on this Saturday. Let me start there. How surprised are you that with the release of as much oil from the U.S. and these other nations around the world, there hasn't been a diminishment in the price of oil as a result?
Well, it's certainly true that previous releases from the SPRO have had a larger impact, even when the releases were smaller. For example, I remember back in 2000, we had a so-called swap using the petroleum reserve. It was only 30 million barrels, and the price of oil dropped about 15% quite quickly. So it's a little bit surprising, to be honest, that there hasn't been more movement. On the other hand, I have to say that the run up in prices, while it is quite considerable, is a bit lower than I might have expected as well. So getting into triple digits is something that doesn't surprise us. And I remind you that the Brent benchmark, for example, which is now about $103, $104, was up to about $120. And many traders are not ruling out even a 150 benchmark if the war and the Strait remains blocked for some time.
Mr. Secretary, in a similar vein, I want to ask you about this Defense Production Act move by the Trump administration. They've restarted this Sable. The pipelines are now owned by Sable Offshore in California, but this is a controversial project because it had been shuttered for environmental reasons. This is not something that happened just this week. This has been a long-standing debate between members of the Trump administration and the government of California that wants to keep it closed. The administration wanted to restart production in California, and now they're using the Defense Production Act to get these pipelines going. It could pump about 45,000 to 55,000 barrels a day. Is that going to make any kind of a difference if we're saying that this large glut of oil from the Strategic Reserve may not make a difference? Why do this?
Well, I would say as a one-off, I don't think it will have a major impact. There are other ways of getting that amount of oil, including, of course, the Petroleum Reserve release, which will put about 1.4 million barrels a day onto the market once it gets going. But the question is, would the California move, the Defense Production Act move, be part of a broader effort that could put, let's say, the order of 1 million barrels a day. I don't see that at the moment, but I don't know what the planning is. But certainly, as an isolated event, it would appear to be more an exacerbation of the tensions between the federal government and California than a material impact on the current situation. Also, may I just interject that we quite understandably focus on oil, but we also shouldn't forget that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has a major impact on the liquefied natural gas market, the LNG market. It's also about 20% of the global LNG trade has been taken out of commission, and we are seeing very volatile LNG prices as well in Asia and in Europe. Not in the United States. I mean, natural gas in the United States has stayed fairly stable in price because the international natural gas market is not equilibrated in the same way as oil. But this is a big impact, and natural gas, as a reminder, there may be some options for minimizing the impact on power production, for example, but it's also very important for heating homes, for serving industrial processes. So I wouldn't take my eye off the natural gas markets as well.
Underscoring the importance of that, Bloomberg reporting that India brokered a deal with Iran to get 2 ships of liquefied natural gas out of the Strait to India. So we're seeing the importance they're placing on the emphasis they're placing on the importance of that. Mr. Secretary, I want to get your reaction to what we've seen in the last few weeks. The Treasury Secretary working to relax sanctions on Russian oil sanctions to get Russia some of this oil that is in tankers. And I'm curious what you make of that. He's acknowledged the fact that this kind of diminishes the argument that the Trump administration and the Biden administration before that made about kind of keeping oil away from Russia during its incursion in Ukraine. Your reaction to that, the seeming ease with which they've done that in recent weeks?
Well, obviously, this is one mechanism for putting, million or more barrels of oil onto the market. But in the bigger geopolitical context, it's not surprising that Europe, for example, has pushed back very hard because this is putting more funding into the Russian coffers, which presumably will be used against Ukraine. In fact, one of the ironies is the estimates have been that Russia may be gaining $150 million a day extra revenue from the relaxing of sanctions and the increase in the oil price, which they are presumably selling at to mainly China and now India. But the Russians could also be using some of that money to buy more Iranian drones, with a certain irony there, which of course are being used with great impact against the Ukrainians after the Russian invasion. Yeah. So personally, I'm not favorable. I think we do need to maintain a broader geopolitical view, and while the administration in the United States is obviously prioritizing the Gulf situation and the domestic gasoline price situation over the Ukrainian situation, for the Europeans, if anything, it's probably in the opposite order. And I do think that we need to maintain our alliances, our strong role in NATO. So basically, I certainly don't like the idea that Russia is getting more revenue right now in the middle of its war against Ukraine.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to pivot a bit and use the other side of your knowledge, which is on nuclear threats. The president has made the argument that there was an imminent threat in Iran, and that's why he needed to act. It is a point of contention, the breakout time and whether the amount of time it would take of Iran to go from the level of enriched uranium it had to a functional nuclear weapon had increased at all in recent weeks or months. First of all, what is your take on how imminent that nuclear threat is? Is it any more than it was last summer when the U.S. attacked and said then it had obliterated most of the nuclear facilities? And if the regime were to fall, are you concerned about securing that enriched uranium, that nuclear material, should there be a non-functional government in Tehran?
Well, yes, I am quite concerned, but I think it's very important to put this in a certain context. And frankly, I don't believe this is being emphasized enough. Namely, that starting in 2021, Iran began enriching to 60% purity, if you like. And in the media, with all due respect, I think the message is consistently that it's not quite weapons grade.
Right.
But what is not stated is that you do not need weapons grade to make a nuclear explosive. And 60% enriched uranium was quite adequate for being used directly in a nuclear explosive. So in my view, Iran had crossed a red line in the sense of accumulating enough weapons usable material for, approaching, let's say, 10 explosives. So was there a particular event that made the weapon threat more imminent? I didn't see any, but I do want to emphasize that since 2021, they have been accumulating a lot of directly weapons usable material, and that to me is my highest priority on the nuclear side would be resolving the issue of where that material is. The Iranians have stated that it's pretty much buried under rubble in Isfahan. Right. I'm not taking anything at face value. Certainly the IAEA has stated, the International Atomic Energy Agency has stated that the material was spread out over 3 locations. But I don't even take that at face value in the sense that as the military actions last June neared, I would not exclude that Iran moved some fraction of that material to yet another hidden location. So I think resolving that issue of the 60% uranium is the #1 priority on the nuclear side. And I don't see any realistic way of doing that other than after the fighting stops, one way or another, and I don't have the answer, getting the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back into Iran with cooperation from whatever is the Iranian government at that time to resolve the question of where is the 60% uranium and how do we get rid of it? I think there's been no credible explanation from the Iranians as to why one would have 60% enriched uranium for any civilian purpose. And I think the #1 priority is to find the stuff and get rid of it.
We woke up this morning to news that North Korea had tested some ballistic missiles in the overnight hours.
Because there wasn't enough going on.
Yeah. President Trump readying to make this trip to China to meet with President Xi, and he's, I think, admitted that he'd like to meet with the North Korean leader as part of that trip. As we focus so much on the Middle East, what is your counsel about how much we should be concerned about what's happening in North Korea and the prospect of them developing or using weapons, nuclear weapons going forward?
Well, obviously, at a time like this in the Middle East and with so many military assets committed there, other players like the North Koreans certainly can be up to mischief. And I would say that in terms of long-range missiles, the North Koreans were certainly well ahead of the Iranians. We have been concerned that Iran was on a trajectory to have intercontinental range ballistic missiles, let's say, within a decade. But of course, North Korea has already demonstrated such missile capability. I do want to I don't want to hyperventilate in the sense that the North Koreans as well have not, to my knowledge, demonstrated that they could mate a nuclear weapon to a long-range missile and have it survive in the difficult conditions of re-entry of such a missile. But they clearly are well ahead, and they are putting down a marker, I think, prior to the summit in China, that they should not be relegated to the back burner.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your time on this Saturday. That's Ernest Moniz, the former energy secretary under President Obama. He's the founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation and the co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative.
Not making me feel much better about
giving us
the security of Iran's nuclear material,
yes.
but it's important that we know what the state of play is. All right, a U.S. federal judge has put the brakes on the Justice Department's criminal probe of the Federal Reserve and its chair, Jerome Powell, saying the investigation was part of a, quote, improper campaign. U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro blasted the ruling, vowing to appeal it.
Jerome Powell today is now bathed in immunity, preventing my office from investigating the Federal Reserve. This is wrong, and it is without legal authority.
Here to talk about the significance of this and look ahead to the Fed meeting, which kicks off on Tuesday of this week, is Jeff Mason, once again, our Washington correspondent, who joins us from South Florida, where he's traveling with the president, and Maria Eloisa Capurro, who covers the Federal Reserve for us, and I believe will be at that briefing?
At the briefing
this week, when Fed Chair Jerome Powell briefs reporters on Wednesday at the conclusion of that meeting. Let me start with you, Maria, and just get a sense from you of how this advances this story. This is something that Fed Chair Jerome Powell saw egregious enough that he came out with a kind of unexpected statement, acknowledging the fact that the Fed and he had been served these subpoenas and pushing back on the level of political interference as he sees it. With this news, with this kind of scathing opinion from a judge in D.C., how does the story advance?
Well, I can tell you that I had like a long list of questions on the economy headed to the presser, and now I'm adding more questions on politics for sure. So basically what we are trying to assess after what we heard yesterday from U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro, we're trying to assess what happens next with whether Powell stays at the board after his term as chair.
Because he's still a governor with a long term beyond that.
He has still like a couple of years to go. Senator Tom Tillis has said that he is not going to
they're not going to move anything forward.
Exactly. And we have the formal nomination of Kevin Warsh to succeed Powell. So we are heading into this meeting with a lot of questions on the economy, but also a lot of questions on the leadership of the Fed and how does that look like going forward. We were talking to some analysts yesterday, like right after Pirro's presser, and there's already a lot of people who expect Powell to still remain at the chair for more meetings beyond May.
And this is a radical shift, because this was his second to last meeting, and people just assumed it was that it was going to wrap up after this.
And for a president who's been trying to get rid of this guy for quite some time, this might backfire.
And let's be mindful that this also matters for investors in terms of what happens with rates. It's like two different situations. If Kevin Warsh is confirmed, he has been saying that he would like favor interest rate cuts. It's a new leadership of the Fed. He has to sway a lot of people in that committee. So that's one scenario if he gets into the building again. And then another scenario is whether Powell stays as a leader that we already know, likely to be a more of status quo leadership and rate path moving forward.
Yes. I'm going to read a bit from that tweet from Senator Tom Tillis, who again had kind of proposed that he wouldn't allow any Fed nominees to advance as all of this, as the specter of the U.S. Attorney's actions loomed over this. He said, "This ruling confirms just how weak and frivolous the criminal investigation of Chairman Powell is, and it's nothing more than a failed attack on Fed independence. We all know how this is going to end, and the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office should save itself further embarrassment," he writes, "and move on. Appealing the ruling, as Jeanine Pirro said she would, will only delay the confirmation of Kevin Warsh as the next Fed chair." Jeff Mason, let me turn to you, because we saw Kevin Warsh on Capitol Hill this week. He was meeting with Senator Tillis, among others, kind of making his case to be confirmed as the next Fed chair. What is the White House's reaction to this? And indeed, we see such a close relationship between the White House, the president, and the Justice Department writ large. Where in that orbit is Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia?
Well, I'll take that last question first. I mean, Jeanine Pirro is an ally of the president, and he installed her in this position for a reason. And she knows that, and she has used that as motivation for the cases that she's gone after, including the Fed. But Senator Tillis has got a lot of cards, and he clearly is willing to play them. So I would guess that the administration is paying very close attention to that, given that the president is very eager to have Warsh confirmed and leading the central bank. I think it's also worth just underscoring that this is the central bank that the administration is going after, not just the president, but the people around him. And it's a long priority held by both sides of the political aisle that central banks, in this case the Fed, should have independence. And that is one of the institutions that President Trump, and one of the traditions, I should say, that President Trump has really attacked since coming back into office this second time.
But Jeff, one of the few things we've seen that it seems able to move a sometimes intransigent president are the markets. And interest rates have been a particular pet peeve of his. And if he sees that this could tie up his nomination to get, Kevin in there and Jerome out of there, is there any chance that you can foresee a way of the White House trying to spin this and having Jean Pirro back down from this? Is there any chance that the president looks at this, realizes it's going counter to what his ultimate goals are, and backs down, or is that just not in the fabric of this administration?
You're spot on to say that the markets absolutely do have an impact on President Trump's thinking. And you've seen that just in the last couple of weeks with regard to the war, when he has reacted to oil prices, I think in part to try to tamp down those prices, even though there really was no significant policy change for him to announce with regard to the length of the war. But to the question here at hand, it's tough to answer. Because, yes, the president has an ultimate goal of wanting to bring those rates down and wanting to get his handpicked successor to Jerome Powell at the helm of the Fed. But he's also not someone who likes to back down generally. And if he can find some way of describing it as a win, maybe they will back down. But they'll have to find some way for him and for the administration and Jean Pirro to save face.
Maria, let me ask you about what's going to happen at this next meeting. So as you say, you've revamped your question lines. In the past, the Fed chair has been very reluctant to engage on any of these issues. And I think it was at the last press conference when he was asked about whether or not he would continue. He said something to the effect of, at the appropriate time, I will say so. Not elaborating on what that might be.
Us this line of, I have nothing further for you.
Nothing more to say on that.
So, reporters love that. That's always fun.
That'll happen at some point. But I am curious, just as you set the table for us for that meeting that starts on Tuesday and goes through Wednesday, how do you think the Fed policymakers are looking at this war? There's a tendency throughout history for the Fed to kind of look through big geopolitical events like this one until they can't. But as we've talked about, prices are going up for energy and all manner of other goods and services. How are they thinking about this war, and what do you expect he might say about that at the conclusion of this meeting?
Well, it's interesting because I wanted to we'll go back to what Jeff was saying, and the reality is that investors weren't pricing in, weren't fully pricing in rate cuts anymore, even before what we heard yesterday and the news of this possible appeal. And that's on the back of a very complicated economy. As you were saying, Fed officials have been saying... Why weren't they
pricing in that rate cut?
So it's, I think, shock after shock that Fed officials are saying, but even before the war on Iran and a very disappointing jobs report that we got also last week, Fed officials were saying that they were likely to hold interest rates in this meeting, that they thought monetary policy was well positioned after the 3 rate cuts that they did last year. So heading into this meeting of next week, a whole was pretty much counted for. The thing is that after that, things only got much more complicated, as you have been reporting this morning. The war in Iran has seen oil prices spiraling. It seems to be even broader than that, as you also have been reporting. It's affecting gas prices. It's affecting supply chains. So the textbook reaction for central bankers, there's these textbooks that they get when they go to the Fed, is to look through, as you were saying, to energy shocks, because they really don't know how long-lasting they're going to be. Fed officials in the first few days before heading into blackout, first few days of the war, were already saying that these events certainly increase uncertainty to their economic outlook, but they needed to really wait and see for how long oil prices were going to stay up. But we're all going to grill Powell into how you're thinking, if there's any threshold of oil prices that they may act, and also on their assessment on inflation expectations.
We'll be listening for your question and hopefully for his robust answer to what you ask him on Wednesday when that press conference takes place. Of course, we'll have special coverage of that starting at 2 o'clock on Bloomberg Television and radio with Tom Keene and Jonathan Ferro. Maria Eloisa Capurro, thank you very much for joining us here in New York.
And Jeff Mason, thank you again.
Yeoman's duty throughout the morning. Thank you very much, Jeff, as well.
All right, up next, we kick off our C-Suite Saturdays on Bloomberg this weekend with the CEO of Trane Technologies. They do much more than just that HVAC. It's a wide-ranging conversation, and we really appreciate them coming in and talking about different aspects of different corporations and just kind of, we want to get into the minds of some of these CEOs, not just in the boardroom, but outside of it, when they talk about leadership and everything else.
That's coming up here on Bloomberg this weekend. Stay with us.
Be right back.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of their top stories. And we're learning that a Greek oil tanker was damaged in a projectile or drone attack. This is happening in the Black Sea as it was moving toward Russia. Now, that's according to Greece's shipping agency. Now, no oil spill has been detected. The crew of 24, they are safe. There have been no injuries reported. There's also no claim of responsibility for that attack. Now, meanwhile, we'll take you back to the Middle East, where U.S. military targets on Kharg Island. That's raising some fears on further oil supply disruptions. Now, the island, it processes about 9 out of every 10 barrels of Iran's crude exports. Yesterday, President Trump said the U.S. spared oil infrastructure, but did warn that it could change if Iran interfered with ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said in response that any strike on oil and energy infrastructure would lead to attacks on U.S.-linked energy facilities in the region. The International Energy Agency, it said this week that the war had already created the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. And in other news, the Wall Street Journal reporting the U.S. set to receive an around $10 billion fee for the TikTok deal. Now, that's coming from U.S. investors who were involved in that recently completed agreement for China's ByteDance to sell the American operations of TikTok. And Scottie Pippen is helping to sell Wall Street on prediction markets. Yeah, the Chicago Bulls legend, he was on hand at the Futures Industry Association's annual conference in Florida. He took time taking pictures, shooting hoops with sweaty executives, with conference goers betting on the winner in a live simulation on a new prediction market app from CME Group built with FanDuel, a new one. Sweaty. I think he beat them.
What's crazy to me is the punishment for gambling for people of his era in sports was a career ruiner. Correct. And now you've got these guys endorsing legalized gambling in poly markets.
Scottie Pippen also having a big auction of like all his memorabilia.
He did, yes.
His trophies. I'm a little worried.
Scottie Pippen, you might need some money.
But having watched the miniseries about the Bulls, I know he did not have an advantageous contract, and that's something that's dogged him.
You guys
for a
make
long
fun of me because I know nothing about sports. I watched every episode of that Bulls documentary.
Incredible.
It was fantastic. Storytelling is storytelling.
Recommend it to everybody. All right, just moments ago, we were talking to the Energy Secretary, former Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, and he brought up the fact that HVAC costs are jeopardized here because of the Iran war. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Natural gas, as a reminder, there may be some options for minimizing the impact on power production, for example, but it's also very important for heating homes, for serving industrial processes. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't take my eye off the natural gas markets as well.
Several days ago, as part of our C-Suite Saturday segments, we spoke to the CEO of Trane Technologies, Dave Regnery, about his company and how they are transforming in an ever-changing climate.
Think of Trane Technologies. We're a global HVAC player. Okay, so think about heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. We're also a leader in transport refrigeration with our Thermo King brand. We're a pure play climate innovator. And, our purpose is to challenge what's possible and innovate for a sustainable world. And over the last 6 years, we've had just a great run. I mean, our compound annual growth rate on the top line is 11%, a little bit over 11%. And on the bottom line, it's over 20%. So I'm super proud of what our team's been able to accomplish. And as I always tell people, we've had a great run over the last 5+ years, but the future looks even brighter than what I saw 5 years ago.
And the company itself, I mean, I'm familiar with you guys from your home product, which is a smaller portion of your portfolio. But the company itself has existed in some form since 1913. And you've been around, well, almost that long. No, I'm just kidding. But you did start, at the company, not in existence.
I just got a compliment when I came down. Someone said, "You look younger than me." I said, "Okay."
I'm sorry, I meant duration you've been at the company. But you started as an intern.
I started as an intern back in 1985, just to date me a bit here. But yeah, I mean, when I came out of college, I was going to go into investment banking. And I decided, no, I'll take this opportunity and go learn a business. And I figured I'd be there for just a short period of time. But I just had so many different roles in the company. I kept advancing to different areas of the company. And People always ask me, well, how'd you get to where you are? Is it luck or hard work? I tell them, well, the luckier I get, the harder I work, right? But it's just, I've had the opportunity to run all the businesses that we have in the company today. So I know them very, very well. And it's just such a great company. When I started as CEO, and I've been the CEO now for coming up on my 5th year, I knew we were a great operator and I knew we were a great innovator, but we weren't thought of as a growth company.
Why not?
Because we weren't growing at the rates that we should be growing at. And I knew we had every opportunity to be this growth company. And trust me, you don't become a growth company just because the CEO puts it on a PowerPoint and say, hey, let's become a growth company.
If only.
It doesn't work quite that way. But one of the things that we did was we had to change the mindset. So we have, as I'm sure most companies do, we have an annual operating plan, and that kind of sets every business's plan for the year. And I won't say it was a negotiation, but it kind of felt like it at times. Like people wanted a lower number because nobody wants to miss their forecast. And early on, we changed it, and we basically said, so the first business comes in, presents their operating plan to us, and that was like, 2 or 3% growth, right? Which is, incremental. Mm-hmm. So the assignment that they took away, I said, come back in 2 weeks, and I want you to tell us, my CFO and myself, what you need to invest to grow at 15%.
Swing for the fences.
Yeah, and so here we are. So roll forward. Each business comes back 2 weeks later, and they come back with these investments. And my CFO is kicking me under the table, saying, "Dave, I don't know if we could afford all these." I said, "No, it's not. They'll never be able to spend that amount of money." But by the way, I need a mindset shift change. And that was kind of the catalyst for us to start thinking about, hey, we can be a growth company. We are going to invest.
You mentioned your optimism for the future. We're at a moment where so many businesses are being disrupted by AI or have the potential to be disrupted by AI. Talk about your involvement in this boom in data centers that I mentioned just a moment ago. Suffice to say, you might not have predicted that a few years back, but this has become a huge growth opportunity for you, a huge driver of the growth that you're talking about.
Sure. I mean, look, data centers, we've always been strong in the data center vertical, okay? But we're also very strong in other core verticals, and we track 14 different verticals, and data centers is one. But data centers has been very, very strong. And we're part of the thermal management system within a data center. So data centers produce a lot of heat. That heat has to be removed. We're the company that helps the data center OEMs remove that heat. And it's really through chiller technologies. It's through what they call CDUs or cooling distribution units, fan walls. There's lots of different components that make up that thermal management system. But we're a leader in that space, but we've been a leader in that space for decades.
But this is kind of controversial because these data centers are going into areas and they're driving up energy costs. And as much as people like to chat GPT things, they also like to not pay a ton for energy bills. Is there a balance to be struck there?
Yeah, I believe there is because, like I said, we're very strong in other verticals, right? And we need the intelligence from data centers to help us make buildings smarter. And if you think most buildings, they use about 40% of the energy in a building. And by the way, globally, 30% of all energy is for buildings. But 40% of that is for heating and cooling.
Wow.
And we know most buildings operate very inefficiently, like 30% inefficiently, a very conservative number. We've developed algorithms to make buildings smarter. And this is why I'm so excited about the future.
Dave, talk a bit about who you're hiring to work for your company. So I mentioned 45,000 employees. Are you able to find the kind of workers that you need in this environment? I know that there are reports that this is a difficult labor market for a lot of people. Who are you looking for, and what is the training process like for those new employees?
Yeah, great question. Look, 5 years ago, when we started as Trane Technologies, or 6 years ago now, we had 35,000 employees. Today, we have over 45,000 employees. So growth companies create job opportunities. I'll start with that. Now, you need to be able to recruit the right talent, like service technicians, right? We're always looking for great service technicians. And we learned during the COVID period that it's really hard to recruit these positions and find the right talent. So we developed an apprenticeship program. And today, the apprenticeship program is now backed by the Department of Labor. I believe we have about 400 employees that are part of this apprenticeship program. And by the way, depending on your experience, this apprenticeship program could be 2 years to 4 years. And here we're just changing lives of people. We now use our hourly workforce as a place to recruit for the apprenticeship program for technicians. Whether it works or not, you're going to learn a lot by saying yes and understanding what someone else's problems are, right? And, that's our whole mindset. And we love being close to customers. We love working towards yes, and we love our innovation.
Dave, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being here, for being our very first CEO Saturday, C-Suite Saturday guest.
I feel privileged to be here. So thank you very much, and thanks for your time today, and good luck with your show.
Thank you for that. When we come back, the Pointed News Quiz. Take us with you no matter where you go. You can watch us on Bloomberg TV, listen on Bloomberg Radio, stream us live on the Bloomberg Business app. Wherever you are, we're there. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back now for this weekend's Pointed News Quiz, the news quiz for risk takers.
I'm very excited about this, as I was last week until I lost the first inaugural round.
That is true. I'm sorry, was that? Yes, you did lose to me last week. However, I have not studied as much as I did last week, so this may be your week.
There are 3 categories, as usual. Lisa Mateo, Quizmaster Extraordinaire.
Yes.
What are the
Give us the lay of the land first. Lay of the land. Here's what we have. Yes, I know. I see it in your face, David. Yeah. Okay, so you basically have 30 chips in front of you, each of you. So Christina has 30, David has 30, okay? Now, based on those 3 categories, you're going to place your chips where you think you know the best. If you get the answer wrong, you hand over those chips you bet to me. Yes. Okay, and you lose them, and you lose some points. Okay, so let's get to our categories. This is what David was asking for. All right, I'm ready. Okay, the first category is oil.
Oil. We've been talking about it at some length this morning.
Which is going to make it extra embarrassing.
We should be in good position for this one.
Second category, Asia politics.
Asia politics.
Okay. And third category is Hollywood. You know, Oscars around the corner, guys.
They are. And I've already demonstrated how little I know about this year's film and
It's not your forte. You have other strengths, David Gura.
All right.
Okay. So, Christina, you're going 10 across the board.
I'm going to do an even split. I know.
Okay. The first one, David's going in 20.
I'm going 20 on that.
Okay.
Oil, again, we've talked about it a lot.
Yeah.
So I feel like.
I know, but I'm nervous.
Asia politics.
I don't know.
I must admit, I'm not an expert on Asia politics.
Are you ready for this question?
Viewers may be disappointed. Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, here you go. Play with us along at home, too, as well. Okay, so question is, oil and gas giant Shell agreed to sell which brand to the private equity firm Monome for $1.3 billion? How are you feeling about those 20?
Oh, my gosh. I was not expecting I really have no idea.
Which brand?
Which brand?
Okay, think of that's the thing.
Of the Shell company.
Shell subsidiary?
Correct. Yeah. Which brand?
Okay, I'm thinking.
So they agreed to sell it.
Yeah. All right.
Private equity firm.
Okay.
Monomoy. Okay.
Is that a hint?
No. But it's a brand that you're maybe familiar with if you get an oil change.
Oh. Okay. All right.
If you get an oil change, feel better? Okay, ready? Let's flip it.
Synthetic or regular oil when you change the oil?
Oh, you just flip it.
Valvoline.
Oh, and what do you have?
Jiffy Lube?
Jiffy Lube, Christina.
No, are you kidding me?
Oh, my God.
It's like the only thing I know about oil changes.
This is the best game ever.
The only thing you know about oil changes is Jiffy Lube.
And that I never get them done, and then my brother yells at me.
I take your 20, David Gura. Okay.
I'm going to have to rework this game.
I'm just going to sit over here and do this a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah, count them up.
Okay, gloat. Here we go. Asia politics.
Yes.
You may recoup your winnings here. Okay, ready? Let's see.
I bet nothing on
Here we go.
Yeah.
Balendra Shah, a rapper turned politician, is on a course to become the prime minister of which country? Balendra Shah.
Balendra Shah.
Yes, a rapper turned politician.
Okay. All right.
The prime minister of which country? On course to become the prime minister. Country in Asia.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Of course, Asia politics. Was that a good hint? Okay, here we go.
Right.
We've had a long week here at Bloomberg.
Flip it. Thailand, David. Nepal, Christina. Nepal is correct. She's got it again. Oh, you didn't bet anything on that one.
No, I didn't, but I feel like
I only know that because of Gen Z uprisings, and it seems very appropriate that they would then elect a rapper.
Yes.
Bingo.
Very in touch with the Gen Z around the world.
You know me and the youths. I am so cool.
Her and the Ute. Okay, here we go.
Look at his sunglasses.
Yeah, they're very cool. I would like to see you rocking those.
No, you wouldn't.
Mayhaps.
Okay.
All right.
David, I feel you're going to do better in Hollywood.
I feel like everyone is so disappointed.
But you bet 10?
Now.
Okay.
I bet 10.
You bet 10. Yeah. Okay, let's see. The question is, Netflix will pay up to $600 million for Interpositive. It's an AI movie-making company founded by which actor?
This. I hope that you do, too. Not really.
Which actor? $600 million.
Can I spell it?
A lot of money.
I can. I think so.
She's writing furiously, Christina can.
Okay.
All right, you ready?
I'm ready. And
Flip
I got it right.
David, what'd you write?
Ben Affleck.
And Christina?
Timothy Chalamet.
Chalamet. Why is it so hard to say Chalamet?
It is Ben Affleck.
It is Ben Affleck.
You have
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I redeemed myself.
Okay, I missed that story this week.
Christina, you got that wrong. Hand over your 10 to me.
Wait, Ben Affleck is doing movie-making AI?
He has a company.
He has a company AI. Netflix bought it for $600 million. Okay?
Nothing.
But
Got
okay.
nothing.
Okay.
Is there a bonus?
Are we ready for a bonus?
And what do I win
Because
if I get the bonus?
Respect.
Everything is great again for me?
Yeah, I might give you 10 back.
Okay.
I
That
don't
would be
know.
a
I'll think
tie.
about
All right,
it.
that would
to
be
make it a
a
tie.
tie.
I'm fine with that.
Okay?
Okay.
Okay, I'll give you 10 back if you get this one. Because it's food and beverage is the last category, okay?
I do like both.
We're glad to know. Swig, have you heard of this one?
No.
It has nearly, we're off to a good start, has nearly 150 stores, specializes in which type of soda using flavored syrups, juices, and cream.
Okay, all right.
Your kids have to know this. My daughter loves this thing.
Do you remember
I don't know.
Well, I don't know. Remember Surge? Remember
I do
Surge?
not.
when that was a
I love
soda?
Surge.
Really?
Green,
I
it was
don't.
absolute
Yeah,
trash. It was so great.
I don't know what happened to that.
Okay, this is
Took it off
Swig.
the market.
Right until we're
Swig.
tight on time. Ready?
Okay, ready?
Sorry, we're tight on
Flip
time.
it, guys.
Yes, probiotic sodas.
Salty?
Salty
no.
Salty
it's
sodas.
dirty soda. Do you know the dirty soda?
No, tell me about it.
Mountain West, Texas, the Hulu reality show, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives,
I
have
see.
made it popular.
Oh, I do
You're
vaguely
not a
remember
fan
this.
of The
No,
Secret
but I
Lives
was
of
okay.
Mormon Wives? Okay, the winner is Christina. Yes, 20 again
2-0.
for the second week in a row.
That's 2-0. But I will say you did beat me in almost every rehearsal. So it's just you'll come back. You'll come
All
back.
right.
He's feeling good. He's
Lisa
feeling
Mateo,
good.
thank you very much.
You tried, David Gura.
I
I'm
tried.
very proud.
That's all I can do on this show is try. You can test your knowledge on all 10 questions on the Pointed Quiz. If I have no shame, I will go do that after the show. You can take it at Bloomberg.com/pointed. You can find it on the business app as well. Thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend. Tomorrow we'll speak live with Democratic Congressman Adam Smith and Republican Congressman Mike Lawler. We hope you join us starting at 7 o'clock Wall Street time in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini, along with Lisa Mateo. For our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, Masters in Business is up next. For our TV audience, Wall Street Week with David Weston starts right now.